A millionaire abandoned his baby on the roadside to ensure he left no heirs. Years later, at a critical moment in his life, the millionaire was rescued by a homeless man who, to his surprise, was identical to him. The revelation shook his foundations, forcing him to face the consequences of his past decisions. The evening was falling over New York City, painting the sky in golden hues that contrasted with the modern skyscrapers of the financial district. Victor Blackwell, imposing in his tailored Italian suit, walked with firm steps along Fifth Avenue, ignoring the admiring glances his presence aroused among passers-by. At 55, he was the very image of business success. Perfectly groomed salt-and-pepper hair, angular face marked by decades of tough decisions, and a posture that denoted innate authority. However, something wasn't right. For weeks, an inexplicable fatigue had been haunting him, transforming each step into a monumental effort. The doctors had been clear that morning. He urgently needed a bone marrow transplant. The news, like a slap from fate, had left him stunned. For the first time in decades, the powerful Victor Blackwell felt vulnerable. "Money can't buy everything, Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Thompson had told him that morning. "We need to find a compatible donor, and time is not on our side." As he advanced along the sidewalk, the doctor's words echoed in his mind like a tormenting echo. The world around him began to blur. The voices of the city transformed into a distant buzz, and his legs, once firm, began to falter. "Are you all right, sir?" A young and concerned voice penetrated the fog that was beginning to envelop him. Victor tried to respond, but the words refused to leave his mouth. The last thing he saw before darkness enveloped him was the face of a young man in his mid-20s, with kind eyes and an expression of genuine concern. Ethan Miller, who had just finished his shift at the hospital where he worked as a nurse, reacted with the quickness his profession had taught him. He held the man before he hit the pavement and, with the help of some passers-by, carefully placed him on the ground. "I need space," Ethan shouted as he loosened the businessman's tie and checked his vital signs. His expert hands moved with precision, while his mind processed each detail with professional clarity. It was then that something caught his attention, a golden glint peeking out from the collar of the businessman's shirt. Without thinking, Ethan instinctively brought his hand to the medallion that hung from his own neck, a relic from his unknown past that he had always carried with him. "The ambulance is on its way," someone announced from the crowd that had formed. Ethan continued monitoring the unconscious man, not taking his eyes off his face. There was something familiar about those features, something that awakened an inexplicable sense of déjà vu in him. The medallion on his neck seemed to weigh more than ever. As they waited for the ambulance, Ethan noticed that the man was beginning to regain consciousness. His eyes opened slowly, disoriented at first, until they focused on the face of the young man attending to him. "Easy, sir," Ethan said softly. "I'm a nurse, and I'm here to help you. The ambulance is on its way." Victor, still dazed, fixed his gaze on the young man. Something in those eyes, in that way of speaking, provoked a deep unease in him. And then he saw it. The medallion hanging from Ethan's neck, identical to his own, swinging gently as the young man leaned down to check his vital signs again. Time seemed to stand still. The sounds of the city faded away, and for a moment there were only the two of them, and the twin medallions that connected them across an abyss of 18 years. What's your name?" Victor managed to articulate, his voice trembling. "Ethan Miller," the young man responded, noticing the pallor spreading across the businessman's face. The sound of the ambulance sirens broke the moment. The paramedics arrived and took control of the situation, but Victor couldn't take his eyes off Ethan, nor from the medallion hanging from his neck. A medallion that he himself had left with his son on that stormy night 18 years ago. "I'll go with you to the hospital," Ethan said with determination as the paramedics prepared the stretcher. "You shouldn't be alone at a time like this." Victor nodded weakly, unable to articulate words. His mind was a whirlwind of memories and guilt, as fate, with its peculiar sense of irony, once again intertwined two lives that ambition and pride had separated so long ago. In the emergency room of Mount Sinai Hospital, the organized chaos of the medical staff contrasted with the deafening silence that enveloped Victor Blackwell. Lying on the hospital bed, he couldn't take his eyes off Ethan, who was professionally conversing with his colleagues about his condition. Every gesture of the young man, every movement, seemed like a window to the past, a poignant reminder of his own features in youth. His vital signs are stable now, Ethan was explaining to Dr. Sarah Evans, who was reviewing Victor's medical file. But the fainting could be related to his condition. What condition? The doctor interrupted, looking up from the papers. Mr. Blackwell needs a bone marrow transplant, Ethan replied, surprising Victor. I heard him mention it as he regained consciousness in the ambulance. Dr. Evans nodded gravely, while Victor observed the interaction with a mixture of admiration and fear. Ethan's presence awakened memories in him that he had tried to bury for years. The torrential rain of that night, the screams of Elizabeth, his mother, demanding that he get rid of the problem, the baby's cries. Mr. Blackwell, Ethan's voice brought him back to the present. Is there someone we can call family? The word family hit Victor like a stab. No, he replied dryly, though his gaze softened as he saw the genuine concern in the young man's eyes. Just my assistant, Patricia Morgan. She's in my phone. Ethan nodded and prepared to make the call, but before he could walk away, Victor stopped him. The medallion, he began, pointing to the object hanging from Ethan's neck. Where did you get it? A shadow crossed the young nurse's face. His fingers instinctively caressed the golden medallion, a gesture that Victor recognized as his own. It's the only thing I have from my previous life, Ethan replied, with a mixture of sadness and pride. My adoptive mother, Grace, says I was wearing it when she found me. Victor's heart skipped a beat. His hands began to tremble as he searched under his own shirt, extracting an identical medallion. Ethan froze, his eyes alternating between both jewels, identical down to the smallest detail. Impossible, Ethan muttered, unconsciously moving closer. At that moment, the door to the room burst open, revealing the imposing figure of Elizabeth Blackwell. At 70 years old, the Blackwell family matriarch maintained the aristocratic bearing that had characterized her all her life. Her cold, calculating eyes scanned the scene before fixing on Ethan. What is this employee doing so close to my son? Elizabeth demanded, her voice as sharp as steel. Mother, Victor began, but Elizabeth interrupted him with a gesture. Patricia called me. I'm here to take you home, Victor. I've already coordinated with your personal physician to attend to you there. Ethan instinctively backed away from the hostility of Elizabeth, but his eyes couldn't stop returning to the medallion Victor was holding. The tension in the room was palpable, charged with secrets and unanswered questions. Mr. Blackwell needs to rest, Dr. Evans intervened, sensing the discomfort in the environment. And we need to perform some additional tests before considering his discharge. Elizabeth straightened to her full height, ready to protest, but something in her son's gaze stopped her. Victor had regained some of his usual composure and was now observing Ethan with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. I'll stay overnight for observation, Victor declared firmly. Ethan, he called to the young man who was already preparing to leave, could you be my assigned nurse? Of course, Mr. Blackwell, Ethan replied, ignoring Elizabeth's withering glare. As Ethan left the room, Elizabeth approached her son's bed. What are you doing, Victor? She whispered urgently. That boy, there's something about him I don't like. Victor closed his eyes, exhausted by the weight of secrets and lies. Mother, he responded in a low but firm voice. For the first time in 18 years, I believe fate is giving me a second chance. Elizabeth paled at hearing these words, recognizing in them a threat to everything she had built. Outside the room, Ethan leaned against the wall, his hand clutching the medallion as a whirlwind of questions and emotions stirred his mind. The night shift at the hospital promised to be the longest of his life. Night stretched over Mount Sinai Hospital like a blanket of black velvet, while Ethan made his night rounds. His steps inevitably led him towards room 507, where Victor Blackwell was resting, or at least trying to do so. Can't sleep? Ethan asked as he entered and found Victor sitting by the window, contemplating the city lights. Sleep and I haven't been good friends lately, Victor replied, turning to observe the young man. The dim light of the room accentuated the resemblance between them, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by either of them. Ethan began to check Victor's vital signs with professionalism, though his hands trembled slightly as he approached. The medallion on his neck seemed to weigh a ton. Your adoptive mother, Grace, Victor began in a soft voice. What is she like? The question took Ethan by surprise, but a smile lit up his face. Grace is extraordinary. She found me on a stormy night in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. She says I was crying so loudly that she heard me from her apartment half a block away. Victor closed his eyes, the memory of that night hitting him hard. Her stormy night, he repeated, his voice breaking. Yes, during the great storm of 2006, Ethan confirmed, adjusting the IV. Grace always says it was Providence that guided her to me. She couldn't have children of her own, you know, but she says God gave her the son she always dreamed of. In the hallway, Elizabeth Blackwell stopped as she overheard the conversation. She had returned to the hospital intending to convince Victor to move home, but the words she heard left her paralyzed. Grace gave me everything, Ethan continued, unaware of Elizabeth's presence. We didn't have much money, but I never lacked love. She taught me that true wealth is in the heart. Did you ever try to find your biological family? Victor asked, his heart racing. Ethan was silent for a moment, his hands unconsciously playing with the medallion. During my teens, I thought about it many times, but Grace was always honest with me. She told me everything she knew, that she found me with this medallion and a blue blanket with the initials EB embroidered on it. Victor abruptly stood up from the chair, staggering. Ethan instinctively held him, and for a moment father and son were closer than they had been in 18 years. EB, Victor whispered. Ethan Blackwell. In the hallway, Elizabeth stifled a cry. Her hands gripped the doorframe as memories of that stormy night assaulted her. She herself embroidering those initials, thinking that maybe, someday... What did you say? Ethan asked, releasing Victor and taking a step back. Before Victor could answer, a nurse hurriedly entered the room. Ethan, we need your help in the ER. There's been a multiple car accident. Ethan hesitated, looking alternately at Victor and the door. Professional duty won the battle. I'll be back later, he promised, quickly leaving the room. Elizabeth took the opportunity to hide in a nearby room, her mind working frantically. When she was sure Ethan had moved away, she entered her son's room. What do you think you're doing, Victor? She hissed, closing the door behind her. What I should have done 18 years ago, Mother, Victor replied, facing her. Acknowledging my son. Your son? Elizabeth laughed humorlessly. The same one we agreed to give up for adoption to protect the family name. The mistake that almost destroyed everything we built? He was my son, Victor exclaimed, his voice trembling with contained emotion. And I abandoned him because you convinced me it was for the best. But look at him now, Mother. He's a good man, a respected professional. Everything you feared he wouldn't be. Elizabeth approached her son, her face a mask of determination. Victor, think clearly. You need a bone marrow transplant. If this boy turns out to be compatible, he could be your only chance. Don't ruin it with unnecessary sentimentality. Sentimentality? Victor looked at her in disbelief. Is that what you call a father's love for his son? I call sentimentality anything that threatens the empire we've built, Elizabeth replied coldly. And I remind you that there's more at stake than your sudden paternal remorse. At that moment, an envelope fell from Elizabeth's pocket. Victor picked it up before she could prevent it. Upon opening it, his eyes widened in surprise. What is this, Mother? He asked, though the answer was clear in the documents he held. Have you been investigating Ethan all this time? Elizabeth raised her chin, defiant. Of course, did you think I wouldn't realize who he was the moment I saw him? I'm your mother, Victor. I know you better than anyone, and I know our family's features perfectly well. Dawn found Ethan in the hospital cafeteria, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The night had been intense in the ER, but his mind kept returning to the conversation with Victor Blackwell and those mysterious initials. EB. You look terrible, commented Olivia Taylor, his best friend and fellow nurse, sitting across from him. Tough shift? You have no idea, Ethan replied, fiddling with the medallion. Olivia, do you believe in coincidences? Before Olivia could answer, Dr. Evans appeared in the cafeteria, her face showing a mixture of amazement and concern. Ethan, I need to speak with you privately. In her office, the doctor spread several documents on the desk. Mr. Blackwell's preliminary results came in this morning. His condition is more serious than we thought. He needs the transplant urgently. Ethan nodded, processing the information professionally. I understand, but why are you telling me this? Because, the doctor paused significantly, when processing his blood type and other markers, the system showed a surprising match with you. Time seemed to stand still. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "What are you saying?" "The genetic markers suggest a direct first-degree kinship," Dr. Evans explained gently. "In other words, Ethan, there's a very high probability that Mr. Blackwell is your biological father." At that precise moment in room 507, Victor was confronting his mother again. "Why do you have a complete file on Ethan's life?" he demanded, waving the documents he had found the night before. Elizabeth remained imperturbable. "Did you really think I wouldn't monitor the only heir who could threaten the Blackwell empire? I followed every step of his life since we left him at that cathedral." "We left him?" Victor laughed bitterly. "You forced me, Mother. You convinced me it was best for everyone, that a child out of wedlock would destroy our reputation. And I was right." Elizabeth slammed the arm of her chair in frustration. "Look at us now, Victor. We're one of the most respected families in New York. Our companies employ thousands of people. Did you want to risk all that for a youthful romance?" "He was my son." Victor's voice broke. "My blood. And now he could be your salvation." Elizabeth softened her tone. "The doctors say you need a compatible donor. Don't you see that fate is giving us the perfect opportunity? Use this situation to our advantage." "Our advantage?" Victor looked at her in disbelief. "Are you suggesting that I use my own son as a source of bone marrow without telling him the truth?" "I'm suggesting that you be smart." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Ethan is already willing to help you as your nurse. A simple compatibility test, and if it's positive..." The door burst open, interrupting the conversation. Ethan was there, pale but determined, holding the lab results in his trembling hands. Dr. Evans was behind him, her expression grave. "No additional test will be necessary," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "The results are already here." Elizabeth rose abruptly, while Victor felt his heart stop. The silence in the room was deafening. "According to these analyses," Ethan continued, looking directly at Victor, "we're compatible, very compatible, as much as a father and son." Tears began to run down Victor's face. Elizabeth, for the first time in years, seemed to lose her composure. "Ethan, Victor began, but Ethan raised a hand to stop him. "All my life I wondered why." His voice trembled but remained firm. "Why would someone abandon their child on a stormy night? Was my existence so terrible that I deserved to be discarded like garbage?" "It wasn't like that." Victor tried to get up, but his weakness kept him in bed. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Ethan interrupted, emotions finally overflowing. "That you preferred your empire, your reputation, over your own son. Or are you going to blame your mother for the decisions you made?" Elizabeth took a step forward, but the look Ethan gave her stopped her in her tracks. In his eyes was a mixture of pain and determination that reminded her too much of the young Victor. The wind blew strongly in the hospital garden, where Ethan had sought refuge after the confrontation. His hands were still shaking as he dialed Grace's number, desperately needing to hear the voice of the woman who had truly been his mother all these years. "Mom." His voice broke upon hearing the familiar "hello" on the other end of the line. "Ethan, my love, what's wrong?" The concern in Grace's voice was palpable even through the phone. "I found him, Mom." Tears began to fall freely down his cheeks. "Or rather, he found me, my biological father." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Grace finally spoke, her voice trembled. "It's Victor Blackwell, isn't it?" Ethan froze. You knew?" "Oh, my boy," Grace sighed deeply. "There's so much you need to know. Can we meet? There are things I need to show you, things I've kept all these years waiting for the right moment." Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Victor faced his own emotional storm. "Satisfied, Mother?" he asked bitterly. "The secret you were so determined to hide has finally come to light." Elizabeth remained standing by the window, her rigid posture betraying her apparent calm. "Don't act like you're the victim, Victor. All my decisions were to protect this family, including Ethan." "Protect him?" Victor laughed humorlessly. "By abandoning him on a stormy night? We left him in front of a cathedral." Elizabeth turned abruptly, with the medallion that would allow him to identify himself if ever things changed. "I made sure Grace Miller would find him myself." The revelation hit Victor like lightning. "What did you say? Did you really think I would leave a Blackwell's future to chance?" Elizabeth approached the bed. "I investigated for weeks, looking for the right person to raise him. Grace Miller. Widowed, childless, a schoolteacher, with a heart of gold and impeccable values. I knew she passed by that cathedral every night after giving private lessons. Victor felt the world spinning around him. All this time, you've been manipulating our lives like we were chess pieces. I've been protecting us, Elizabeth corrected. Do you think it didn't hurt me? He was my grandson. But I also knew that at that moment you weren't ready to be a father. You needed to build the empire, become the man you are today. In the garden, Ethan listened attentively to Grace on the phone. When I found you that night, she explained, there was a woman watching from a black car. At first I didn't pay attention to it, but over the years I began to notice her presence at key moments in your life. Your first day of school, your graduation. Elizabeth Blackwell, Ethan muttered, the pieces of the puzzle painfully fitting in his mind. Yes, Grace confirmed. One day when you were 5 years old, she approached me. She offered me money for your education, but I refused. However, she made me promise her something, that I would raise you with the values that she could no longer instill in her own son. Ethan collapsed onto a bench in the garden, overwhelmed. Why did you never tell me? Because I wanted to protect you, my love, and because she made me swear that I would wait until fate brought you together naturally. She said that only then could the truth be revealed without destroying anyone. At that moment, Olivia appeared in the garden, running towards Ethan. Ethan! Mr. Blackwell! He's having a crisis. He needs you! Ethan jumped up, professional instinct momentarily overcoming his emotional turmoil. Mom, I have to go, but this conversation isn't over. I know, my love, Grace replied. I'll be there in an hour. There are letters you need to read, things you need to know before making any decision about the transplant. As he ran towards room 507, Ethan felt the weight of 2 decades of secrets on his shoulders. The medallion on his neck, which had always been a symbol of hope, now felt like a chain binding him to a fate he never asked for. As Ethan entered the room, he found Victor struggling to breathe, while Elizabeth remained paralyzed in a corner. Their eyes met with his biological father's, and for a moment, all the resentment and confusion vanished, replaced by an instinctive concern he didn't even know existed within him. Victor's crisis had been controlled, but the atmosphere in the room remained tense. Ethan performed his nursing duties mechanically, avoiding eye contact with his biological father, while Elizabeth observed every movement from her position by the window. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway made everyone look up. Grace Miller appeared in the doorway, her presence radiating a warmth that contrasted with the cold hospital environment. In her hands, she held a weathered wooden box. "Mom," Ethan whispered, and the word fell like a stone in the silence of the room. Elizabeth straightened, immediately recognizing the woman she had chosen as her grandson's guardian. Grace, for her part, looked directly at the Blackwell matriarch. "Mrs. Elizabeth," Grace greeted with serene dignity. "It's been many years." 18 years, 2 months and 15 days, Elizabeth responded, her voice barely a whisper. Victor observed the exchange with amazement. You know each other." Grace approached the hospital bed, her gentle eyes resting on the man lying there. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm Grace Miller, the woman who has had the privilege of raising your son." Ethan felt his heart contract as he saw tears forming in Victor's eyes. Grace turned to him, extending the wooden box. "My love," she said softly, "there's something you need to see. Something I've kept all these years, waiting for the right moment." With trembling hands, Ethan opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters, yellowed by time, along with photographs and small objects. A silver rattle, a pair of baby shoes, and a blue blanket with the initials EB embroidered on it. "The first letter arrived a week after I found you," Grace explained, taking out an envelope from the stack. "And they kept coming, one every month for years." Ethan unfolded the first letter, his heart pounding as he recognized the elegant handwriting. "Dear Grace, I write this letter with a heart heavy with guilt and gratitude. Guilt for having allowed my son to be separated from his father, and infinite gratitude to you for having taken him in. I have observed how you hold him, how you sing to him, how you dry his tears. I see in you the maternal love that I myself did not allow myself to feel. My son deserves to know the truth someday, but not now. Not while ambition and pride still govern this family. I beg you to protect him, to teach him the values that we have forgotten in our pursuit of power and prestige. The medallion he wears is the key to his inheritance, not only material but spiritual. When the time comes, he will know how to use it to claim his place in this world. With deep respect and remorse, Elizabeth Blackwell. The silence that followed the reading was deafening. Elizabeth had closed her eyes, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Victor looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "There's more," Grace continued, taking out another letter. "One for each birthday, each Christmas, each important achievement in Ethan's life." Mrs. Elizabeth never stopped watching, never stopped caring, even if it was from the shadows. "Why?" Ethan's voice trembled. "Why keep the secret for so long?" Elizabeth finally approached, her mask of coldness completely melted. "Because I needed to protect you. From my own son, from myself, from this world of appearances and lies that we had built. I wanted you to grow up to be a different man, better than us." "And he is," Grace intervened proudly. "Ethan is everything I dreamed for him. Compassionate, hard-working, honest." Victor extended his trembling hand towards his son. "Ethan, But before he could continue, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. Dr. Evans entered urgently. "Excuse the interruption, but we need to make a decision about the transplant. The latest tests show that Mr. Blackwell's condition is worsening faster than anticipated." All eyes turned to Ethan, who held the letters against his chest like a shield. The weight of the decision, the life of his biological father, rested in his hands, along with 18 years of secrets, pain, and unrequited love. Grace approached her son and hugged him gently. "My boy," she whispered in his ear, "whatever decision you make, I'll be by your side, always." The silence in the conference room of the hospital weighed like lead as Dr. Evans explained the transplant procedure. Ethan listened attentively, his hand intertwined with Grace's, while Victor and Elizabeth remained seated on the other side of the table. "The procedure is not without risks," the doctor explained, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "As a donor, you will experience pain, discomfort, and will need several days of recovery. Additionally," she paused significantly, "your medical history shows a pre-existing heart condition that could complicate the process." Grace squeezed her son's hand. "What kind of complications?" she asked with a trembling voice. "General anesthesia always presents risks in patients with cardiac history," the doctor responded. "In Ethan's case, his congenital arrhythmia, the same one that almost took me when I was a baby," Ethan interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. Victor sat up abruptly in his chair. "What did you say?" Grace nodded softly. "When I found Ethan that night, he was very sick. He spent his first months of life in and out of the hospital. The doctors said it was a miracle he survived." Elizabeth brought a hand to her chest, the color draining from her face. "That's why the first letters had no response," she murmured. "You were fighting to keep him alive. Day and night," Grace confirmed, tears shining in her eyes. "I sold everything I had to pay for the treatments, but every time it seemed we wouldn't make it, an anonymous donor appeared who covered the expenses." Everyone's eyes turned to Elizabeth, who kept her gaze fixed on her intertwined hands. "I couldn't allow my grandson," her voice broke. "I couldn't lose him twice. And now," Dr. Evans intervened, "we must carefully consider the risks. Ethan, as your doctor, I must warn you that this procedure could trigger serious complications in your heart condition." "No," Victor stood up abruptly. "I won't allow him to risk his life. There must be other compatible donors." "Mr. Blackwell," the doctor shook her head, "your bone marrow type is extremely rare. The compatibility with Ethan is almost perfect, but nothing," Victor interrupted. "I won't lose my son twice, not because of me." Ethan, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "The decision is mine." Everyone turned to him. His voice, though soft, had an unshakable determination. "For years," he continued, "I wondered why I had been abandoned. I wondered if there was something wrong with me, if I wasn't good enough to be loved. But Grace," he looked at his adoptive mother with infinite affection, "taught me that true love isn't about deserving but about choosing." He stood up, taking the medallion from his neck. "This medallion was always a reminder of my origin, of the unanswered questions. But now I see that it's also a symbol of sacrifice. The sacrifice of a grandmother who watched from the shadows." He looked at Elizabeth. "The sacrifice of a mother who gave everything for a child who wasn't hers." He smiled at Grace. "And now it's my turn to choose." "Ethan, please," Victor pleaded. "You don't have to do this." "I don't have to do it," Ethan confirmed. I choose to do it. Not for you," he looked directly at Victor, "but for the values that Grace taught me, for the kind of person I've become thanks to her." Dr. Evans nodded gravely. "If that's your decision, we'll begin preparations immediately, but I must insist that everyone understand the risks involved." "I understand them," Ethan replied, "and I accept." Grace stood up and hugged her son, tears running freely down her face. Elizabeth remained motionless, her face a mask of contained emotions. And Victor looked at his son with a mixture of pride and terror that threatened to break his heart. "I'll schedule the procedure for tomorrow morning," the doctor announced. "Ethan, I need you to be admitted tonight for preparations." As everyone prepared to leave the room, Olivia appeared at the door, her face showing concern. "Ethan," she called softly, "there's someone who insists on seeing you. He says he's your brother." The man waiting in the hallway radiated an unsettling presence. Tall, elegant, with the same aristocratic bearing as the Blackwells, but there was something in his eyes that conveyed a calculating coldness. Alexander Blackwell straightened up as he saw Ethan, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "So it's true," Alexander said, studying Ethan's face. "The prodigal son has returned." Elizabeth, who had come out behind Ethan, froze at the sight of Alexander. "What are you doing here?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Can't I visit my sick father?" Alexander replied with feigned innocence. "Or perhaps I came to meet my younger brother, the legitimate heir of the Blackwells." Ethan took a step back, feeling the tension emanating from Elizabeth. Grace instinctively placed herself at his side, as she had done throughout his life when she sensed her son was in danger. "Alexander," Victor's voice resonated from the door of the conference room, where he leaned with evident effort. "This is neither the time nor the place." "And when will it be, Father?" Alexander advanced towards him. "When Ethan takes his place as the legitimate heir. When everything I've worked for years is handed to him on a silver platter." "I don't want anything," Ethan intervened, his voice firm. "I'm here as a donor, nothing more." Alexander laughed humorlessly. "Nothing more. Please, little brother. Nobody voluntarily gives up the Blackwell Empire. I know that better than anyone." Grace stepped forward. "My son is telling the truth. He has his own life, his own values." "Ah, the saintly adoptive mother." Alexander looked at her with disdain. "Do you know that while you were raising your precious Ethan with values and principles, I was struggling for a simple acknowledgement from my father? That while he was receiving anonymous donations for his medical treatments, I had to prove my worth every day." "Enough!" Elizabeth's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Alexander, your father needs to rest. Ethan is preparing for a delicate procedure. This is not the time for..." "For what, grandmother?" Alexander interrupted, pronouncing the word grandmother with venom. "To remember how you denied me too, how you kept me in the shadows while watching Ethan from afar." Dr. Evans, who had witnessed everything, intervened. "Mr. Blackwell, I must ask you to leave. My patients need peace." "Patience?" Alexander looked at Ethan with renewed interest. "You're a patient too? What happened to being the savior donor?" "My son has a heart condition," Grace responded, defiant, "and yet he's willing to risk his life for the man who abandoned him. That, Mr. Blackwell, is true nobility." "Or true stupidity," Alexander muttered. Then, addressing Ethan, "Do you know why they really abandoned you, little brother? Have they told you the whole truth about that night?" "Alexander," Elizabeth's cry echoed down the hall. "What truth?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The truth about the agreement." Alexander smiled maliciously. "The agreement between our grandmother and your biological mother, an agreement that involved a considerable sum of money." The color drained from Elizabeth's face. Victor staggered, holding onto the wall. "You're lying," Elizabeth whispered. "Am I, grandmother?" Alexander pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Then I suppose these documents are lying too. I found them in your safe. Fascinating reading, I must say." Dr. Evans noticed how Ethan's heart monitor, connected for his pre-procedure evaluation, began to show alterations in its rhythm. "Enough," ordered the doctor. "Security, please." But the damage was already done. Ethan looked alternately at Elizabeth, Victor, and Alexander, while his heart beat increasingly erratically. "Ethan," Grace held him as she saw him stagger. "My love, your heart." I need air," Ethan muttered, taking a step back. "Ethan!" Grace's cry echoed down the hall as her son collapsed in her arms. Olivia immediately appeared with an emergency team, while Alexander observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and something else. Guilt? "Everyone out," Dr. Evans ordered as resuscitation maneuvers began. "Now!" Amidst the chaos, the envelope Alexander was holding fell to the floor, its contents spilling out into the hospital hallway like pieces of a macabre puzzle that threatened to destroy what was left of the Blackwell family. The emergency room became a whirlwind of activity as the medical team fought to stabilize Ethan. Grace, forced to wait outside, prayed silently, her hands clutching the medallion that Ethan had given her moments before the collapse. In the hallway, Olivia bent down to pick up the scattered documents, but Alexander stopped her. "I'll do it," he said, his voice noticeably less arrogant than minutes before. However, Elizabeth was quicker, snatching one of the papers from the floor. 18 years, Elizabeth muttered, reading the document with trembling hands. 18 years keeping this secret, and now— "What secret, Mother?" Victor demanded, leaning heavily against the wall. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes full of unshed tears. Ethan's mother, Sophia Carter. She didn't voluntarily abandon her son. Grace turned sharply towards her. "What are you saying?" "Sophia was a young waitress," Elizabeth continued, her voice breaking. "She fell in love with Victor when he was just starting to take charge of the companies. When she got pregnant—" Elizabeth paused, closing her eyes. "I offered her money to disappear." "But she refused," Alexander interjected, his face somber. "Didn't she, Grandmother?" "She refused," Elizabeth confirmed. "She said no amount of money would be worth her child's happiness, that Victor had the right to know his baby." Victor slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, the weight of the revelation crushing him. "What did you do, Mother?" "I threatened her." Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "I told her that if she didn't leave, I would make sure she could never get a job anywhere, that I would destroy her. But that wasn't all," Alexander added, pulling another document from the floor. When Sophia kept refusing, Elizabeth resorted to more persuasive methods. "I pressured her until she signed the papers relinquishing parental rights," Elizabeth admitted. "I told her it was best for the baby, that with us he would have a bright future. And then," Alexander pressed, "and then I helped her leave the country." Elizabeth straightened up, facing the accusing looks. "I got her documents, a job in England. I promised her the child would be all right." Grace, who had listened to everything in silence, finally spoke. "Is she alive?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Yes," Elizabeth finally responded. "She lives in London." She never stopped asking about Ethan. At that moment, Dr. Evans came out of the emergency room, her face showing professional concern. "We've managed to stabilize him," she announced, "but his condition is delicate. The stress triggered a severe arrhythmia. I'm afraid the transplant will have to be postponed." "Postponed?" Victor stood up with difficulty. "But you said it was urgent." "Ethan's life is urgent too," the doctor responded firmly. "In his current state, subjecting him to surgery would be extremely risky." Grace approached the doctor. "Can I see him?" "In a few minutes," Dr. Evans nodded. "He's sedated, but stable." Alexander, who had remained unusually silent, stepped forward. "There's something else you need to know," he said, pulling out a final document from the envelope. "Something about Ethan's heart condition." Elizabeth paled. "Alexander, don't—" "His heart problem," Alexander continued, ignoring his grandmother, "wasn't congenital as everyone believed. It was the result of medical negligence the night he was born. A negligence that Elizabeth covered up to protect the reputation of the hospital the Blackwells had just acquired." The revelation fell like a bomb in the hallway. Grace brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a cry. Victor looked at his mother in horror. "Is it true?" Grace asked, her voice trembling with rage. "All those months my baby fought for his life, ours were because of you." Elizabeth began, but the words seemed to choke her. At that moment, a sharp sound from the emergency room interrupted the confrontation. Dr. Evans ran back in, shouting orders to her team. "He's going into fibrillation," was heard from inside the room. "Prepare the defibrillator." Grace collapsed into a chair, her face bathed in tears. Alexander, surprisingly, was the one who approached to support her. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his mask of coldness completely melted. "I didn't want this to happen. I just wanted the truth." Elizabeth remained motionless in the center of the hallway, the documents still in her hands, while the sound of machines and urgent voices of the doctors filled the air. The weight of 18 years of secrets and manipulations had finally caught up with her, and now her grandson's life hung by a thread for the second time. The hours in the waiting room turned into endless torture. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the emergency doors, her lips moving in a silent prayer. By her side, surprisingly, Alexander remained seated, his usual arrogance replaced by an expression of genuine concern. "Mrs. Miller," Alexander murmured after a long silence, "there's something you should know about why I came today." Grace looked at him, noticing for the first time the resemblance he also bore to Victor. Beneath the mask of coldness, there was a wounded young man seeking his place in the world. "When I discovered the documents in Elizabeth's safe," Alexander continued, "I didn't just find the truth about Ethan. I also found letters my mother wrote to Victor, begging him to acknowledge me." On the other side of the room, Victor raised his head, listening intently. "Your mother," Grace said softly. "What happened to her?" Alexander swallowed hard. "She never recovered from the rejection. She spent years trying to get Victor to acknowledge me, sending letters, photos. Elizabeth intercepted everything. When I finally managed to contact Victor on my own, I was already an adult. And I acknowledged you," Victor intervened, his voice laden with remorse. "But it was too late." "Too late," Alexander repeated bitterly. "My mother had fallen ill with heart disease, worn down by years of struggle. When I finally obtained the Blackwell surname, she was no longer there to see it." Elizabeth, who had remained silent in a corner, visibly shuddered. "That's why," Grace began to understand, "that's why you reacted like that when you saw Ethan." "He had what I never had," Alexander admitted. "A mother who loved him unconditionally, a grandmother who, albeit from the shadows, watched over him. Even Victor, who didn't even know of his existence, kept his medallion as a treasure." At that moment, Dr. Evans emerged from the emergency doors, her face showing signs of exhaustion. "We've managed to stabilize him again," she announced, "but his heart is very weak. He'll need specialized treatment before we can even consider the transplant." "What about Victor?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Without the transplant, we'll look for other options," the doctor responded firmly. "For now, Ethan can receive a brief visit. Mrs. Miller." But before Grace could stand up, Alexander spoke. "Wait, there's something else you need to know." He turned to Victor. "Father, I'm compatible." A stunned silence filled the room. "What are you saying?" Victor asked, sitting up with difficulty. "I had the tests done weeks ago when I found out about your condition," Alexander explained. "I'm compatible. I can be your donor." Elizabeth took a step forward. "Alexander, son, I'm not doing it for you," Alexander interrupted, looking at his grandmother. "I'm not even doing it for Victor. I'm doing it for Ethan, because he showed me what it truly means to be a Blackwell." Grace stood up, and to everyone's surprise, hugged Alexander. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can go see Ethan now," Dr. Evans gently reminded them. In the room, Ethan lay connected to multiple monitors, his face pale but serene. Grace sat beside his bed, taking his hand in hers. "My brave boy," she murmured, caressing his forehead. Alexander remained in the doorway, observing the scene. "Mrs. Miller," he called softly, do you think Ethan will be able to forgive us someday? All of us?" Grace looked at her sleeping son, remembering all the nights she had heard him wondering about his biological family. "Forgiveness," she finally responded, "is like love. It's not earned, it's chosen. And my Ethan, he always chooses to love." From his bed in the adjoining room, Victor listened to the conversation through the wall, tears flowing freely down his face. For the first time in his life, he understood that true wealth wasn't in the empire he had built, but in the hearts he had hurt in the process. Elizabeth, standing in the hallway between both rooms, took out one last letter from her purse, one she had never had the courage to deliver. It was from Sophia, Ethan's biological mother, dated just a month ago. Elizabeth entered Ethan's room silently, where Grace continued to watch over her son's sleep. The Blackwell matriarch seemed to have aged years in the last few hours, her usual aristocratic bearing replaced by the weight of guilt. "Grace," she called softly, "there's something you need to read." Something I perhaps should have shown you all a long time ago." With trembling hands, Elizabeth extracted the letter from her purse. The paper, although recent, showed signs of having been read multiple times. Grace took the envelope cautiously, as if it might burn her fingers. "It's from Sophia," Elizabeth explained. "Ethan's biological mother." Grace held her breath as she began to read. "Dear Elizabeth, after 18 years, these words flow with the force of a river, contained for too long. Every day since I left New York, I have lived with the weight of my decision, or rather, the decision you forced me to make. I have followed my son's life from afar, thanks to the few pieces of news that reached me through contacts at the hospital. I know he's healthy, that he's a nurse, that he saves lives. I know that a wonderful woman named Grace has raised him with the love I couldn't give him. For that, my first word to you after so long is thank you. Not thank you for taking me away from my baby, but thank you for making sure he reached someone like Grace. In my initial pain and anger, I couldn't see that perhaps in your twisted way of doing things, you were trying to protect not only the Blackwell name, but also my son. Now I know that Ethan has heart problems. Doctors in London have confirmed that it's a hereditary condition in my family, not medical negligence as you always believed. My father and my brother suffered from it too. This knowledge torments me, because it means I've bequeathed him not only a medallion, but also this struggle. Elizabeth, I'm returning to New York, not to claim a place in Ethan's life that doesn't belong to me, but because doctors in London have developed an experimental treatment for his specific type of arrhythmia. I've been working with them for months, studying Ethan's case through the medical reports you've been sending to the hospital. I know Victor is sick and needs a transplant. I also know that Ethan, with his noble heart that he inherited from who knows where, will want to help his father. But before that happens, he needs to receive this treatment. His life depends on it. I'm not asking you to let me see my son. I don't have that right. I only ask that for once you put his well-being above the pride of the Blackwells. The medical team from London will arrive next week. It's up to you to decide if this information will reach those who can save Ethan in time. With hope, Sophia Carter." Grace looked up from the letter, tears running down her cheeks. "When did you receive this?" 3 weeks ago, Elizabeth replied, her voice breaking. "But my damned pride prevented me from acting. And now—" "Where is she?" Grace interrupted, standing up. "Where is Sophia?" "In the hospital," a voice answered from the door. It was Dr. Evans. "She's been working with our team for 2 days, under another name. She's one of the most respected cardiologists in London." Ethan stirred in the bed, his eyelids trembling slightly. Grace ran to his side while Elizabeth retreated towards the door. Is she here?" Elizabeth whispered. "She's in my office," the doctor replied, "with the complete protocol of the treatment that could save Ethan's life. But we need to act fast." At that moment, Ethan opened his eyes. His gaze, though clouded by medication, fixed on the letter that Grace still held. "Mum," he whispered weakly. Grace leaned over him, kissing his forehead. "I'm here, my love." "No." Ethan tried to focus his vision. "My other mum, I saw her. She was here, checking the monitors. I thought I was dreaming." Elizabeth brought a hand to her chest, while Dr. Evans nodded softly. "It wasn't a dream, Ethan," the doctor confirmed. "Dr. Carter has been personally monitoring your condition since she arrived. I need to see her." Ethan tried to sit up, but the monitors began to sound in protest. "What you need is the treatment," Dr. Evans intervened firmly, "and she's the only one who can administer it correctly." Grace looked at Elizabeth, who remained paralyzed at the door. "It's time," she said softly. "It's time for all the truths to come to light." Elizabeth nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "I'll go get her," she whispered, turning towards the hallway. In his adjoining room, Victor listened to everything, his heart beating painfully. His son had not only found his father, but was about to reunite with the mother he should never have lost. And all thanks to the unconditional love of 3 extraordinary women: Grace, who raised him; Elizabeth, who protected him from the shadows; and Sophia, who never stopped fighting for him, even from afar. Time seemed to stand still when Sophia Carter entered the room. At 43, she maintained the same sweetness in her gaze that had captivated Victor 2 decades ago. Her white doctor's coat couldn't hide the trembling of her hands as she approached the bed where Ethan lay. Grace instinctively took a step back, but Ethan held her hand. "Don't go, Mom," he whispered. "I need you here." Sophia stopped at the foot of the bed, her eyes drinking in every detail of her son's face. "You're exactly as I imagined," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You have your paternal grandmother's eyes, but the smile is mine." Ethan observed her with a mixture of emotions on his face. "I saw you before," he said, "when you were checking the monitors. I thought I was dreaming. I couldn't resist the temptation to take care of you, even if it was from the shadows," Sophia admitted. "As I've done for 18 years. "Why?" Ethan's question floated in the air, laden with decades of doubt and pain. Sophia looked at Grace, who nodded gently, encouraging her to continue. "Because sometimes," Sophia began, "the greatest love a mother can show is to step away. When Elizabeth offered me money to disappear, I refused. But when she showed me the opportunities the Blackwells could offer you, you abandoned me for money," Ethan interrupted, the pain evident in his voice. "No," Sophia took a step forward. "I left you because at that moment, I was a 25-year-old waitress, with no college education, no resources. Elizabeth offered me an option. I could keep you with me, condemning you to a life of hardship, or I could let you go, accept the opportunity to study in England, and become someone who could help you if you ever needed me." "And you did," Dr. Evans interjected. "Dr. Carter is one of the most respected cardiologists in Europe. Her research on hereditary arrhythmias has saved hundreds of lives." Ethan looked at the monitors recording his heartbeats. "The heart condition, it comes from you?" Sophia nodded. "From my family. When I found out about your heart problems, I dedicated my life to finding a treatment. Every patient I attended to, every research I conducted, it was all thinking of you." Grace, who had remained silent, spoke. "That's why those specialists appeared when Ethan was little. The doctors who suggested specific treatments. They were my colleagues," Sophia confirmed. "I asked them to supervise him to keep me informed. Elizabeth never refused to grant them access." At that moment, Alexander appeared at the door. "The team from London is setting up the equipment in the operating room," he announced. "Everything is ready to start the treatment." Sophia turned to Ethan, her face adopting a professional expression that barely concealed her emotion. "The treatment we've developed could correct the arrhythmia permanently. It's a complex procedure, but we have a 94% success rate." "And afterwards, will I be able to be a donor for Victor?" Ethan asked. All eyes turned to him, surprised by his persistence in helping his father. "Ethan," Alexander intervened, "it's not necessary. I will be the donor." "What?" Ethan looked at his newly discovered brother in surprise. "It's the right thing to do," Alexander replied. His former hostility completely vanished. "You taught me something important. Being a Blackwell isn't about inheritances or business empires. It's about doing the right thing even when it hurts." Sophia moved closer to Ethan's bed, finally allowing herself to touch his hand. "Before making any decision about the transplant, we need to cure you first. Would you let me try? Would you give me the chance to be your doctor since I couldn't be your mother?" Ethan looked at Grace, who nodded with tears in her eyes. Then he looked at Sophia, and for the first time he saw in her eyes not the woman who had abandoned him, but the one who had sacrificed everything to be able to save him someday. "I have 2 questions, he finally said. "First, will this treatment really work?" "I've dedicated my life to perfecting it," Sophia replied. "It will work." "Second question," Ethan squeezed Grace's hand while looking at Sophia. "Is there room in a heart for 2 mothers?" Tears began to flow freely down Sophia's face. Grace approached and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, took Ethan's other hand, joining the 3 hands over his heart. "Love," Grace said softly, "never divides. It multiplies." The surgical prep room buzzed with activity from the London medical team as they prepared Ethan for the procedure. Sophia, now in her professional element, reviewed every detail with meticulous precision. "The treatment will be carried out in 2 phases, she explained to Ethan and Grace. "First, we'll introduce a special catheter that will allow us to map exactly where the arrhythmias originate. Then we'll use a revolutionary ablation technique that we've developed in London." Grace held Ethan's hand, observing how Sophia worked. It was fascinating to see the transformation. The vulnerable woman who had cried upon reuniting with her son now moved with the confidence of years of medical experience. "Will it hurt?" Ethan asked, though his voice showed no fear but professional curiosity. "You'll be under general anesthesia," Sophia responded with a warm smile. "When you wake up, you'll feel discomfort, but nothing we can't manage with medication." At that moment, Elizabeth appeared at the door. "May I come in?" Sophia visibly tensed, but maintained her professional composure. Ethan nodded, and the Blackwell matriarch entered with uncertain steps, so different from her usual authoritative walk. "Before the procedure," Elizabeth said, taking something out of her purse, "I want you to have this." In her hands, she held an ancient silver rosary. It belonged to your great-grandmother. She used it in every important moment of her life, and now it should be yours. Ethan took the rosary with trembling hands. "Why now?" he asked softly. "Because I finally understand," Elizabeth replied, her voice breaking. "I understand that the true legacy of the Blackwells isn't in our companies or our name. It's in the love I tried to deny for so long." Sophia, who had been observing the scene while preparing the instruments, spoke without looking up. "The love you denied almost cost your grandson his life. Twice." "I know," Elizabeth turned to her. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repair the damage I caused. To all of you, it's not the time for recriminations," Grace intervened gently. "Now what's important is for Ethan to recover." As if to confirm her words, Alexander entered with Dr. Evans. "Everything's ready in the operating room," the doctor announced. "The London team is prepared." Sophia nodded and began the final preparations. "Ethan, I need you to relax. Think of something nice, something that gives you peace." Ethan closed his eyes, squeezing the rosary in one hand and Grace's hand in the other. "I'm thinking about the day you took me to the sea for the first time, Mom Grace, and how you explained to me that the waves are like the ocean's heartbeats." Grace smiled through tears. "And now your other mom is going to make sure that your heart's beats are as constant as those waves." Sophia, with contained tears, began to administer the anesthesia. "Count backward from 10, my love. 10, 9, 8. Ethan's voice faded as his eyes closed. In the hallway, Victor waited in a wheelchair, accompanied by Alexander. "Do you think he'll ever be able to forgive me?" he asked his older son. "Ethan has already forgiven you," Alexander replied. "The question is, will you be able to forgive yourself?" In the operating room, the medical team worked with millimetric precision. Sophia, with years of preparation for this moment, directed every movement with the concentration of someone who knows they are treating not just a patient, but the son that fate had returned to her. "Beginning cardiac mapping," one of the specialists announced. The screens showed Ethan's heart in detail, each irregular beat telling a story of struggle and survival. Sophia observed the patterns with expert eyes, recognizing in them the same irregular rhythm she had inherited from her family. "It's like looking in a mirror," she murmured to herself. "But this time I can fix it." In the waiting room, 3 generations of women awaited in a silence charged with hope. Grace, who had raised him with unconditional love. Elizabeth, who now faced the consequences of her decisions. And in spirit, the Blackwell great-grandmother, whose silver rosary rested on Ethan's chest, marking each beat with a silent prayer. "Love multiplies," Grace repeated in a low voice, remembering Ethan's words. "And today that multiplied love is going to save him." The hours dragged on in the waiting room like drops of thick honey. Grace nervously knitted with some threads that Olivia had gotten for her, her fingers creating patterns that reflected the complexity of her emotions. Elizabeth observed the hypnotic movement of her hands, remembering how her own mother used to knit while waiting for important news. "What are you knitting?" Elizabeth finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. "A blanket," Grace responded without looking up. "I always knit when I'm worried." "I knitted one just like this the first night Ethan spent in the hospital when he was a baby." Alexander, who had been pacing back and forth, stopped. "What was he like? As a baby, I mean." A soft smile illuminated Grace's tired face. "So small, but with such a strong will. He cried a lot at night, as if his little heart knew something wasn't right. But when I sang to him, he calmed down immediately." "What did you sing to him?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Rock-a-bye baby," Grace replied. "The same song my mother sang to me. It's curious." She paused, her hand stopping for a moment. "In all those nights of crying and worry, I never felt alone. It was as if someone else was watching over him." Because someone was, Elizabeth admitted. There were nights when I stayed in my car, in front of your house, listening to his cries through the open window. I wanted to come in, to explain, to help you, but my pride— "And I," interrupted a voice from the door. It was Victor in his wheelchair. "I was there too once. On the night of his first birthday." Grace looked at him in surprise. "The box of toys, the one that mysteriously appeared on the porch." "It was me," Victor confirmed. "Elizabeth had told me that that Ethan had been adopted by a good family. She didn't tell me who or where, but one night I followed her. I saw her park in front of your house. I couldn't resist leaving something for my son." Alexander sat heavily in a chair. "Meanwhile, my mother and I were living on the other side of the city, waiting for you to deign to acknowledge me." "Alexander," Victor began, but his older son raised a hand. "I don't say it with resentment, not now," he clarified. "I say it because I finally understand why she never stopped trying. A mother's love, or a father's, knows no pride." At that moment, Olivia approached with coffee for everyone. "Dr. Evans says the procedure is going well. They're in the final phase." In the operating room, Sophia worked with millimetric precision, her hands guiding the catheter with the delicacy of someone weaving precious lace. "Starting ablation of the last focus," she announced to the team. "Vital signs stable." Meanwhile, in the waiting room, Grace had resumed her knitting, but now included a new pattern in the blanket. "What's that?" Elizabeth asked, pointing to the design. "A heart," Grace replied. "But look closely. It's not just one heart, they're three intertwined." Elizabeth looked at her curiously. "One for each mother," Grace explained softly. "Sophia, who brought him into the world and now fights to heal him. Me, who had the privilege of raising him. And you, Elizabeth, who, although in a twisted way, never stopped protecting him." Alexander approached to observe the design. "It's beautiful," he said, "like everything true love creates." "True love," Victor repeated, his voice breaking. "Something you and Ethan are teaching me, each in your own way." Elizabeth suddenly stood up, walking to the window. "There's something else you should know," she said without turning around. "Something I've kept all these years." Everyone looked at her expectantly. "The night Ethan was born," she began, her voice trembling. "It wasn't just the heart condition that complicated everything. There was something else, something I saw in Sophia's eyes when she held her baby for the first time." "What did you see?" Grace asked softly. "The same unconditional love I saw in my mother's eyes when I was born," Elizabeth replied, turning with tears in her eyes. "And it terrified me. It terrified me because at that moment I understood that no amount of money, no threat, no manipulation could break that bond. That's why I had to separate them physically, because I knew their hearts would always be connected." At that precise moment, the operating room door opened and Sophia appeared, her face showing signs of exhaustion, but also a hopeful smile. "The procedure is finished," she announced. "His heart, our son's heart, beat strongly and regularly." The recovery room was dimly lit when Ethan began to wake from the anesthesia. The first thing he perceived was the regular and strong sound of his own heartbeat on the monitor, a rhythm he had never heard with such clarity before. "Welcome back, my love," whispered Grace, who hadn't moved from his side. Ethan blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim light. His left hand automatically found the great-grandmother's rosary, which Elizabeth had insisted he keep during the procedure. "The sound," he murmured, his voice hoarse from intubation. "My heart thinks it sounds different." "It sounds as it should," Sophia replied, approaching from the other side of the bed. With professional but tender gestures, she checked the monitors. "Strong, steady, healthy." "Like the sea," added Grace, recalling their earlier conversation. Ethan tried to smile, though fatigue weighed on every muscle in his body. "It worked, then?" "Perfectly," Sophia confirmed, finally allowing herself to take her son's free hand. "The procedure was a complete success. The arrhythmic foci have been corrected, and your heart is responding exactly as we expected." At that moment, Alexander appeared at the door, pushing the wheelchair where Victor sat. "May we come in?" Ethan nodded weakly. Elizabeth, who had been waiting in the hallway, followed them, staying discreetly in the background of the room. "How do you feel, little brother?" Alexander asked, and for the first time, the term sounded genuinely affectionate. "Like I've run a marathon," Ethan responded. "But my heart, it feels light." "That's because it finally beats in sync with your soul," Grace said softly, adjusting the pillows under his head. Victor approached in his wheelchair, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Son, Not now, Father," Ethan interrupted gently. "There's time for difficult conversations. Now just stay here." Sophia observed the scene with a mixture of emotions on her face. As a doctor, she was satisfied with the success of the procedure. As a mother, her heart was divided between the joy of seeing her son recovering and the pain of the lost years. "The London team is impressed," she commented, trying to maintain a professional tone. "Your recovery is faster than expected." "He has good genes," Elizabeth said from her corner, and for the first time that night, a small smile appeared on her face. "And a better heart," added Alexander, "in every sense." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, processing the strange sensation of being surrounded by 3 generations of his family, both biological and chosen. The constant sound of the heart monitor seemed to mark the rhythm of this new chapter in his life. "The blanket," he murmured, noticing Grace's handiwork. "3 hearts?" Grace nodded, showing him the design. "One for each mother who loves you. And each one beats in its own way," added Sophia, "but together they form a perfect melody." Elizabeth finally approached the bed, her steps uncertain but determined. "Ethan, there's something I want to show you." From her purse, she took out a small photo album. "These are yours. Photos I took in secret all these years." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he opened the album. There he was. His first day of school, a swimming competition in high school, his graduation as a nurse. Moments he thought were private, captured by the lens of a grandmother who loved him from the shadows. "At every important moment," Elizabeth whispered, "I was there. Not in the right way, not as I should have been, but I was there." "Like all of us," added Victor, "in one way or another, orbiting around your light, son, even when we didn't know it was you who attracted us." Alexander approached the window, slightly opening the curtains to let in the first rays of dawn. "A new day," he said, "and for the first time the Blackwell family is complete." "No," Ethan corrected, his voice stronger now. "It's not the Blackwell family, it's our family, with all its flaws and virtues, with its mistakes and successes. A family that beats together, like these 3 hearts in Mum Grace's blanket." Sophia checked the monitors one more time, hiding her own tears behind a professional gesture. "The first day of many," she said. "The first day with your heart beating as it always should have. And with all the people I love finally gathered," added Ethan, his eyes beginning to close from fatigue. "Even though the path to get here has been long and painful." "Sleep, my love," whispered Grace, adjusting the blanket over him. "We'll be here when you wake up." "Everyone," Ethan murmured, already half asleep. "Everyone," 3 voices confirmed in unison. Grace, Sophia, and Elizabeth, the 3 mothers who, in different ways, had shaped his heart. And in the midst of it all, Victor observed with an overflowing heart. His own journey of healing had unleashed a wave of hope that continued to grow, reaching more and more families every day. The Blackwell Empire had transformed into something that no amount of money could buy, a sanctuary where broken hearts found their lost melody. A week after the intervention, Ethan's room had transformed into the unofficial heart of the hospital. The walls, once sterile and white, were now decorated with the 3-heart blanket Grace had finished, and the constant flow of visitors had turned the space into a surprisingly cozy place. "The results are extraordinary," Sophia explained while reviewing the latest tests. "Your heart is responding better than we expected. The arrhythmia has disappeared completely." Ethan, sitting on the bed and already with better color, smiled. "It feels different, as if for the first time I could breathe completely." "That's because your heart is finally beating in its natural rhythm," Sophia replied, allowing herself a moment of closeness to caress her son's hair. "The rhythm it should have always had." Grace entered at that moment with a thermos of homemade hot chocolate. "Does anyone want some? It's the special recipe I always prepared for Ethan when he was sick." "Ah, the famous medicine chocolate," exclaimed Alexander from the door, where he had just appeared wearing a hospital gown. Ethan hasn't stopped talking about it. The relationship between the brothers had flourished surprisingly over the past week. Alexander's initial resentment had transformed into an almost fierce protection towards his younger brother. "Ready for tomorrow?" Ethan asked, observing his brother's hospital gown. Alexander nodded, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "All the exams are in order. Doctor, Evans says we can proceed with the transplant as scheduled. You're nervous, it wasn't a question. A little, Alexander admitted, but after seeing you recover so well, I feel like there's nothing to fear. Sophia reviewed Alexander's file that she carried with her. Your vital signs are perfect, and the compatibility with Victor is excellent. The operation should be relatively straightforward. Nothing is straightforward when it comes to the Blackwells, Elizabeth interrupted, entering the room. Her comment, which a week ago would have sounded bitter, now carried an almost joking tone. How's father? Alexander asked. Anxious, Elizabeth replied. But more than for the operation, I think he's nervous about the conversation he wants to have with all of us tonight. Ethan and Alexander exchanged glances. Over the past week, while Ethan recovered and Alexander prepared for the transplant, Victor had been unusually thoughtful, spending long hours in private conversations with his lawyers. Does it have to do with the family empire? Alexander asked, tensing slightly. It has to do with the future, a voice answered from the door. Victor entered in his wheelchair, pushed by Olivia. With the kind of legacy I want to leave. Grace began to serve the chocolate in cups, including one for Victor. Do you want to have that conversation now? It's the right time, Victor replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Before tomorrow's transplant, I need everyone to understand my intentions. Ethan tried to sit up better in bed, but Sophia gently stopped him. Easy. The procedure was a success, but you still need rest. I'm fine, Mom, Ethan responded, and the naturalness with which the word Mom left his lips made Sophia's eyes moisten. My sons, Victor began, his voice stronger than it had been in days. Alexander, Ethan, and yes, Olivia, you should stay too. What I'm going to say affects the future of the hospital. Everyone found a place in the room, forming an intimate circle around Ethan's bed. Elizabeth remained near the window, her posture tense but expectant. During this week, Victor continued, I've had a lot of time to reflect. About the empire we built, about the price we paid for it, about the kind of inheritance I want to leave. And I've made a decision. Father, Alexander began, but Victor raised a hand to stop him. The Blackwell Empire as we know it is going to change. I've decided to transform most of our companies into a foundation dedicated to medical research and supporting families who need costly treatments. A stunned silence filled the room. Elizabeth brought a hand to her chest, but her face showed no surprise. Rather a strange mixture of pride and relief. The first headquarters, Victor continued, will be right here, in this hospital. And I want the direction to be in the hands of those who truly understand the value of healing, both of the body and the soul. His eyes moved from Sophia to Ethan, from Grace to Alexander, including everyone in the room in his vision of the future. But the empire, Alexander began. The true empire, Victor interrupted, is not in the buildings or bank accounts. It's here, in this room, in the love that has survived decades of separation, in the forgiveness that has blossomed where there was only resentment, in the healing that goes far beyond the physical. Ethan took Grace's hand, who in turn extended her other hand to Sophia. The chain of contact extended until everyone in the room was connected, even Elizabeth, who had finally approached the circle. Tomorrow, Victor concluded, a new era will begin for the Blackwell family, not as businessmen but as healers, not as rivals, but as family. Ethan's heart monitor marked a strong and steady rhythm, like a metronome marking the step towards this new future. The morning of the transplant dawned with a soft drizzle that washed the hospital windows. Ethan, now recovered enough to use a wheelchair, insisted on accompanying Alexander to the operating room door. It's curious, Alexander commented as they prepared him for surgery. Just a few weeks ago, the idea of sharing anything with the Blackwell family made me angry, and now I'm about to literally give a part of me to our father. Life has strange ways of healing wounds, Ethan replied, adjusting the 3-heart blanket he had insisted on bringing for his brother. Sophia, who would supervise the operation along with Dr. Evans, approached for the final checks. Your vital signs are perfect, Alexander, and the procedure is much more controlled than the one we performed on Ethan. Are you saying I'm an easier case than my little brother? Alexander joked, but his eyes revealed a glimmer of nervousness. I'm saying, Sophia replied with a warm smile, that you two are equally brave. Elizabeth appeared at the door of the preparation room, her face showing a rarely seen vulnerability. Alexander, she called softly, may I have a moment with my grandson? The use of the word grandson said with such affection surprised everyone. Alexander nodded, and the others discreetly withdrew, leaving Ethan as the only witness to the conversation. For years, Elizabeth began, approaching the stretcher. I tried to control this family's destiny with manipulations and secrets. But you two have taught me that true power lies in truth and love. Grandmother, Alexander whispered. No, let me finish. Elizabeth took his hand. Your mother would be so proud of you today, Alexander. She always saw the best in you, even when I refused to see it. Did you know her well? Alexander asked, his voice trembling slightly. Well enough to know she was right about you, Elizabeth replied, pulling an envelope from her purse. She wrote this letter before she passed away. She asked me to give it to you when you finally found your place in the family. Alexander took the envelope with trembling hands but didn't open it. I'll read it after the operation, he said. So I'll have something special to look forward to. Grace entered at that moment with a thermos. Medicine chocolate for the other son of my heart, she announced, and the naturalness with which she included Alexander in her maternal love made the young man's eyes moisten. Am I your son now too? He asked with a mixture of jest and hope. I always had enough love for everyone, Grace replied, pouring the chocolate into a cup. Some just took longer to find their way home. Dr. Evans appeared to announce it was time to begin. As they prepared Alexander to transfer him to the operating room, Ethan approached his brother. Alexander, he said softly, thank you. Not just for this, he gestured towards the room where Victor waited, but for teaching me that family is bigger than we imagine. Thank you, little brother, Alexander replied, for showing me that forgiveness isn't a sign of weakness, but the greatest strength. As they transferred Alexander, Ethan noticed that his brother had slipped his mother's letter under the three-heart blanket, as if the maternal love woven into that fabric could protect the words waiting to be read. In the waiting room, Sophia prepared to enter the operating room when Grace stopped her. The children of the heart, Sophia replied, are as valuable as those of blood. Elizabeth, who had overheard the exchange, added, and sometimes it's the children who teach the parents the true meaning of love. Ethan observed everything from his wheelchair, his heart beating with a strong and healthy rhythm, as if wanting to mark the tempo of this new family melody they were composing. Together. Take care of our other son, she said simply, and the two women shared a look of deep understanding. The Blackwell Empire, he reflected aloud, is transforming into something that money can't buy, into something that pride can't destroy, Elizabeth added, and into something that love builds day by day, Grace completed, as the operating room doors closed, taking Alexander towards his own act of love and redemption. The 6 hours of surgery seemed like an eternity for the family gathered in the waiting room. Ethan, who had insisted on staying awake despite his own recovery, held the three-heart blanket in his lap, his fingers absently tracing the patterns woven by Grace. The letter is still here, he murmured, feeling the envelope under the fabric. Alexander wanted something special to wake up to. Grace, seated beside him, was knitting another blanket, this time with 4 intertwined hearts. To include Alexander's heart, she explained when Elizabeth looked at her questioningly, because he's also part of this healed family. Sophia came out of the operating room with a tired but smiling face. The operation has been a success. Both Alexander and Victor are responding perfectly. The collective sigh of relief was almost audible. Elizabeth, who had remained standing by the window for hours, finally allowed herself to sit down. Can we see them? Ethan asked. In a few moments, Sophia replied. They're being transferred to the recovery unit. Alexander has been very brave. Like his brother, Grace added, and Sophia nodded with an emotional smile. As they waited, Olivia approached with a thick folder. Mrs. Elizabeth, the foundation documents are ready for your review. The lawyers have incorporated all the changes Mr. Blackwell requested. Elizabeth took the folder with trembling hands. The Blackwell Empire, she murmured, flipping through the pages. Transforming into the Blackwell Foundation for Health and Hope. An appropriate name, Ethan commented, considering that hope is what has kept us together all these years. At that moment, Dr. Evans appeared to inform them they could see the patients. In adjoining rooms, father and son began their recovery. Alexander was the first to fully wake from anesthesia. His eyes immediately focused on the blanket covering him. The letter, he murmured. Ethan, from his wheelchair, pulled out the envelope and handed it to him. It was waiting for you, brother. With trembling hands, Alexander opened the letter from his mother. My dear Alexander, if you're reading these words, it means you've finally found your place in the Blackwell family. Not as an intruder or a secret, but as who you truly are, a man of noble and brave heart. I always knew this day would come, not because of the name or the money, but because true love always finds its way. Your heart, my boy, was always bigger than any resentment, stronger than any rejection. Forgive your father, not for him, but for yourself. And when you find your family, love them with that generous heart you've always had, especially that brother whom Elizabeth protected so much. Something tells me that when you find him, you'll understand that the true legacy of the Blackwells isn't in their companies, but in their capacity to love, with eternal love, your mother. Tears ran freely down Alexander's face as Elizabeth approached his bed. Your mother, she said softly, was the wisest of us all. She saw what took me years to understand, that the true empire is built with love, not power. In the adjoining room, Victor was slowly waking up. Ethan had insisted on being moved next to his father's bed. Alexander? Was Victor's first word. He's fine, Ethan assured. He's in the next room, recovering perfectly. The foundation, Victor began, but Ethan gently interrupted him. Everything is underway, Father. Elizabeth and the lawyers are finalizing the documents, but now you need to rest. There's so much to fix, Victor insisted. And we'll have time for everything, Ethan replied. Time to heal, time to build, time to be the family we always should have been. Grace entered with her new 4-heart blanket, still unfinished. For both to recover under the same love, she said, spreading it over Victor. Sophia, observing from the door with professional eyes but a mother's heart, smiled as she saw how the 2 rooms had become the true heart of the hospital. In one, Alexander read and reread his mother's letter, with Elizabeth by his side, finally being the grandmother she always should have been. In the other, Victor rested under Grace's new blanket, with Ethan watching over his sleep. The empire transforms, she murmured to herself, and with it, all of us. A week after the operation, the boardroom of Angel Hospital had become the temporary operations center for the nascent Blackwell Foundation. The walls, once decorated with portraits of illustrious doctors, now displayed plans and projects for the expansion of the social care program. Ethan, now walking on his own though carefully, studied the documents spread out on the table, while Sophia and Dr. Evans discussed the details of the new cardiac research program. The treatment we developed in London, Sophia explained, could be adapted to help more patients. We just need the right resources. And now we'll have them, Alexander added from his wheelchair, which Grace still insisted he use for a few more days. The annual research budget will be 3 times larger than the current one. Elizabeth, who had been unusually quiet, approached the window overlooking the hospital garden. Victor was right, she murmured. The true legacy isn't in the buildings. It's in the lives we can change, Grace completed, entering with a tray of coffee for everyone. Like mine changed when I found Ethan, and like mine changed when I found all of you, Alexander added, taking a cup of coffee. You know, I've been thinking about the specialty I want to develop in the foundation. Everyone looked at him with interest. I want to create a program for abandoned children, he said, his voice firm but emotional. A program that not only gives them medical care, but also helps reunite separated families like ours. Ethan approached his brother, resting a hand on his shoulder. It's a perfect idea, and I think I know who could lead it. All eyes turned to Grace, who almost spilled her coffee in surprise. Me? She asked, incredulous. Who better? Ethan replied with a smile. You've dedicated your life to education. You know the system from the inside, and more importantly, you understand the true meaning of family. Besides, Sophia added, you'd work together with the medical team. We could create a comprehensive care model. At that moment, Victor entered the room, supported by a cane but with an increasingly firm step. Elizabeth immediately moved to help him, but he raised a hand, determined to walk on his own. I like what I hear, he said, sitting at the head of the table. Grace, your experience would be invaluable for the program. Grace looked around at this family that fate had woven in the most unexpected way. On one condition, she finally said, that the first headquarters of the program be established in the neighborhood where I found Ethan. At St. Patrick's Cathedral, Elizabeth completed, her voice soft. Where it all began. Where everything began to heal, Sophia corrected. And speaking of healing, everyone's latest exams are excellent. The hearts of this family are stronger than ever. In every sense, Alexander added, pulling out his mother's letter that he always carried with him. You know, I've been thinking about the name of the program. What do you suggest? Victor asked with genuine interest. Intertwined Hearts, Alexander replied, looking at Grace's blankets that now decorated a corner of the room. Like the hearts in Mom Grace's blankets, because sometimes families aren't formed by blood but by love. By choice, Ethan added. By destiny, Elizabeth completed. By all the paths that lead us home, Grace said, taking out her knitting. She had started a new blanket, this time with a broader design. How many hearts does this one have? Sophia asked, observing the pattern. All the ones we need, Grace replied with a smile, because a family that heals together, grows together, they all completed in unison. Victor observed the scene with bright eyes. His commercial empire might be transforming into something completely different, but the true empire, that of united hearts and healed souls, was stronger than ever. Next week, he announced, we'll hold a press conference to officially present the foundation and its programs. I want everyone to be there, not as employees or benefactors, but as what we are, a family. Everyone? Elizabeth asked, surprised. Everyone, Victor confirmed, because this foundation will not only treat bodies but also heal stories, and what better example than our own story. The main auditorium of Angel Hospital buzzed with activity on the morning of the press conference. Journalists from all major media outlets settled into their seats, while the communications team gave the final touches to the stage. The newly designed logo of the Blackwell Foundation, 3 intertwined hearts inspired by Grace's blankets, presided over the event. In the preparation room, the family gathered for final details. Ethan adjusted Alexander's tie, while Grace smoothed out non-existent wrinkles in Sophia's dress. Are you sure about this? Elizabeth asked, more nervous than anyone had ever seen her. Exposing our story like this before the entire country? It's the only way, Victor replied, reviewing his notes. If we want the foundation to truly represent transformation and hope, we must start with our own truth. Besides, Alexander added, what better way to launch the Intertwined Hearts program than by showing how our own hearts have united? Sophia, who was adjusting the stethoscope around her neck, she had insisted on presenting herself as the doctor she was, smiled softly. Alexander is right. Our story can give hope to other separated families. And demonstrate that true love, Grace added, can heal even the deepest wounds. An assistant peeked through the door. 5 minutes to start. Ethan approached Victor, helping him stand. Ready, Father? Ready to change the Blackwell story, Victor responded, leaning on his younger son's arm. The family entered the auditorium amid flashes and murmurs. To the surprise of the press, they all sat together on the stage, forming a semicircle that reflected their unity. Victor approached the podium, his posture erect despite the cane in his hand. Good morning, he began. Today I'm not here as businessman Victor Blackwell, but as a man who has learned that the true value of life is not measured in dollars and cents. The journalists took frantic notes as Victor continued. For decades, the Blackwell name has been synonymous with business power. Today I want it to be synonymous with hope and healing. With a gesture, he invited Ethan and Alexander to join him at the podium. My sons, both products of different circumstances but united by the same love, have taught me that true wealth is in the bonds we create. Ethan took the microphone. Just a few weeks ago, I was just another nurse in this hospital. Today, I'm here not only as Victor Blackwell's recovered son, but as a living testimony that love can transcend any barrier. Alexander continued, and I, who once consumed myself in resentment, have discovered that the true inheritance is not in the surname, but in the ability to forgive and love. Sophia then stood up, her white coat contrasting with the elegant attire of the others. As a doctor and as a mother, I have seen how the health of the body is intimately linked to the health of the soul. The Blackwell Foundation is born from this understanding. Grace, with her usual warmth, took the floor. The Intertwined Hearts program will not just be a social aid project. It will be a bridge to reunite families, heal wounds, and create new bonds of love. Elizabeth, who had remained silent, finally approached the podium. Her voice, normally authoritative, trembled slightly. For years, I believed that protecting the Blackwell name meant maintaining appearances at any cost. Today I understand that the true legacy is built with truth and love. The journalists were captivated. The questions began to flow. How exactly will the foundation work? What will happen to the Blackwell companies? Why did you decide to make your family story public? Victor raised a hand to ask for silence. The Blackwell Foundation will invest 75% of our resources in health programs and family reunification. The Intertwined Hearts program, led by Grace Miller and Alexander Blackwell, will be our spearhead. Because we believe, Ethan added, that every story of separation deserves a chance for reunion. Every wounded heart deserves a chance to heal. At that moment, Dr. Evans, who was observing from the front row, noticed something extraordinary. The portable heart monitors that Ethan, Victor, and Alexander were still wearing as a precaution showed perfectly synchronized rhythms. The hearts of the Blackwell family, she whispered to herself, finally beat to the same rhythm. And as the questions continued and the flashes kept flashing, the family remained united on the stage, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in unison, as a living testimony that love, when true, can transform even the most powerful empire into something much more valuable, a healed family. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Newspaper headlines proclaimed, "Blackwell Empire transforms into foundation of hope," and "New York's most powerful family chooses love over money." Social media exploded with the story of Ethan and Alexander, overnight becoming symbols of reconciliation and forgiveness. In the former Blackwell mansion, now in the process of transformation to become the main headquarters of Intertwined Hearts, Grace supervised the renovations while knitting a new blanket. "Another new design?" Ethan asked, who had arrived with blueprints under his arm. "This one is special," Grace replied, showing a pattern that intertwined hearts of different sizes. "Each heart represents a family we'll help reunite. It will be the welcome symbol at the entrance." Sophia entered at that moment, carrying a stack of medical files. "You won't believe this," she announced excitedly. "Since the press conference, we've received over 200 applications from families seeking to reunite with lost relatives. And that's not all," Alexander added, appearing with his laptop. "The country's main medical institutions want to partner with the foundation. The cardiac treatment you developed, Mum Sophia, could be available in all public hospitals in the country." The naturalness with which Alexander called both Sophia and Grace Mom had ceased to surprise anyone. It was as if his heart, like Ethan's, had infinite space for love. Elizabeth, who was organizing documents in a corner, looked up. "Letters have also arrived. Different types of letters," she said softly, showing a pile of envelopes. "They're from other grandmothers like me, who separated their families out of pride or fear. They want to know how they can begin to heal. Then we'll create a special program for them," Victor decided, entering the room leaning on his cane. "We'll call it Bridges of Reconciliation." Dr. Evans, who had arrived for a scheduled meeting, smiled at the scene. "You know, since you made your story public, the organ donation rate at the hospital has tripled. People say that if the Blackwells could open their hearts, they can too." "It's like a chain reaction of love," Ethan reflected, reviewing the mansion's blueprints. "Look at this. Where the business trophy room used to be, we'll now have a nursery for the children of single mothers who need medical attention. And the old vault will become a documentation center," Alexander added, "to help families trace their lost loved ones." Sophia approached one of the windows, observing the garden where several workers were installing playground equipment. "When I left Ethan that night," she said softly, "I never imagined my pain would transform into something so beautiful." Grace stood up and hugged her. "Pain, when transformed into love, can move mountains. Or transform empires," Elizabeth added, joining the hug. At that moment, a young mother with her baby in her arms timidly peeked through the door. She was the first applicant for the Intertwined Hearts program. "Come in," Grace invited her warmly. "Welcome to your new family." The woman, with tears in her eyes, entered holding her baby. "I saw the press conference," she said with a trembling voice. "And I thought that if your family could heal after so much time, yours can too," Alexander completed, approaching with a chair for her. "Tell us your story." As the young mother began to speak, Ethan observed how everyone in the room naturally moved into their roles. Sophia assessing medical needs, Grace offering maternal comfort, Alexander taking notes for the program, Elizabeth organizing resources, and Victor simply observing with bright eyes how his old empire of power was transforming into an empire of love. "You know what's most beautiful?" Ethan whispered to his father. "That this is just the first of many stories we'll help rewrite." "Like ours," Victor replied, squeezing his son's shoulder, "which began with a broken heart and is ending with hundreds of hearts healing together." The main auditorium of Mount Sinai Hospital buzzed with activity on the morning of the press conference. Journalists from all major media outlets settled into their seats, while the communications team gave the final touches to the stage. The newly designed logo of the Blackwell Foundation, 3 intertwined hearts inspired by Grace's blankets, presided over the event. In the preparation room, the family gathered for final details. Ethan adjusted Alexander's tie, while Grace smoothed out non-existent wrinkles in Sophia's dress. "Are you sure about this?" Elizabeth asked, more nervous than anyone had ever seen her. "Exposing our story like this, before the entire country?" "It's the only way," Victor replied, reviewing his notes. "If we want the foundation to truly represent transformation and hope, we must start with our own truth." "Besides," Alexander added, "what better way to launch the Intertwined Hearts program than by showing how our own hearts have united?" Sophia, who was adjusting the stethoscope around her neck, she had insisted on presenting herself as the doctor she was, smiled softly. "Alexander is right. Our story can give hope to other separated families. And demonstrate that true love," Grace added, "can heal even the deepest wounds." An assistant peeked through the door. 5 minutes to start. Ethan approached Victor, helping him stand. "Ready, Father?" "Ready to change the Blackwell story," Victor responded, leaning on his younger son's arm. The family entered the auditorium amid flashes and murmurs. To the surprise of the press, they all sat together on the stage, forming a semicircle that reflected their unity. Victor approached the podium, his posture erect despite the cane in his hand. "Good morning," he began. "Today I'm not here as businessman Victor Blackwell, but as a man who has learned that the true value of life is not measured in dollars and cents." The journalists took frantic notes as Victor continued. "For decades, the Blackwell name has been synonymous with business power. Today I want it to be synonymous with hope and healing." With a gesture, he invited Ethan and Alexander to join him at the podium. "My sons, both products of different circumstances but united by the same love, have taught me that true wealth is in the bonds we create." Ethan took the microphone. "Just a few weeks ago, I was just another nurse in this hospital. Today, I'm here not only as Victor Blackwell's recovered son, but as a living testimony that love can transcend any barrier." Alexander continued, "And I, who once consumed myself in resentment, have discovered that the true inheritance is not in the surname, but in the ability to forgive and love." Sophia then stood up, her white coat contrasting with the elegant attire of the others. "As a doctor and as a mother, I have seen how the health of the body is intimately linked to the health of the soul. The Blackwell Foundation is born from this understanding." Grace, with her usual warmth, took the floor. "The Intertwined Hearts program will not just be a social aid project. It will be a bridge to reunite families, heal wounds, and create new bonds of love." Elizabeth, who had remained silent, finally approached the podium. Her voice, normally authoritative, trembled slightly. "For years, I believed that protecting the Blackwell name meant maintaining appearances at any cost. Today I understand that the true legacy is built with truth and love." The journalists were captivated. The questions began to flow. How exactly will the foundation work? What will happen to the Blackwell companies? Why did you decide to make your family story public? Victor raised a hand to ask for silence. The Blackwell Foundation will invest 75% of our resources in health programs and family reunification. The Intertwined Hearts program, led by Grace Miller and Alexander Blackwell, will be our spearhead. Because we believe, Ethan added, that every story of separation deserves a chance for reunion. Every wounded heart deserves a chance to heal. At that moment, Dr. Evans, who was observing from the front row, noticed something extraordinary. The portable heart monitors that Ethan, Victor, and Alexander were still wearing as a precaution showed perfectly synchronized rhythms. The hearts of the Blackwell family, she whispered to herself, finally beat to the same rhythm. And as the questions continued and the flashes kept flashing, the family remained united on the stage, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in unison as a living testimony that love, when true, can transform even the most powerful empire into something much more valuable, a healed family. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Newspaper headlines proclaimed, "Blackwell Empire transforms into foundation of hope," and "New York's most powerful family chooses love over money." Social media exploded with the story of Ethan and Alexander, overnight becoming symbols of reconciliation and forgiveness. In the former Blackwell mansion, now in the process of transformation to become the main headquarters of Intertwined Hearts, Grace supervised the renovations while knitting a new blanket. "Another new design?" Ethan asked, who had arrived with blueprints under his arm. "This one is special," Grace replied, showing a pattern that intertwined hearts of different sizes. "Each heart represents a family we'll help reunite. It will be the welcome symbol at the entrance." Sophia entered at that moment, carrying a stack of medical files. "You won't believe this," she announced excitedly. "Since the press conference, we've received over 200 applications from families seeking to reunite with lost relatives. And that's not all," Alexander added, appearing with his laptop. "The country's main medical institutions want to partner with the foundation. The cardiac treatment you developed, Mum Sophia, could be available in all public hospitals in the country." The naturalness with which Alexander called both Sophia and Grace Mom had ceased to surprise anyone. It was as if his heart, like Ethan's, had infinite space for love. Elizabeth, who was organizing documents in a corner, looked up. "Letters have also arrived, different types of letters," she said softly, showing a pile of envelopes. "They're from other grandmothers like me, who separated their families out of pride or fear. They want to know how they can begin to heal. Then we'll create a special program for them," Victor decided, entering the room leaning on his cane. "We'll call it Bridges of Reconciliation." Dr. Evans, who had arrived for a scheduled meeting, smiled at the scene. "You know, since you made your story public, the organ donation rate at the hospital has tripled. People say that if the Blackwells could open their hearts, they can too." "It's like a chain reaction of love," Ethan reflected, reviewing the mansion's blueprints. "Look at this. Where the business trophy room used to be, we'll now have a nursery for the children of single mothers who need medical attention. And the old vault will become a documentation center," Alexander added, "to help families trace their lost loved ones." Sophia approached one of the windows, observing the garden where several workers were installing playground equipment. "When I left Ethan that night," she said softly, "I never imagined my pain would transform into something so beautiful." Grace stood up and hugged her. "Pain, when transformed into love, can move mountains. Or transform empires," Elizabeth added, joining the hug. At that moment, a young mother with her baby in her arms timidly peeked through the door. She was the first applicant for the Intertwined Hearts program. "Come in," Grace invited her warmly. "Welcome to your new family." The woman, with tears in her eyes, entered holding her baby. "I saw the press conference," she said with a trembling voice. "And I thought that if your family could heal after so much time, yours can too," Alexander completed, approaching with a chair for her. "Tell us your story." As the young mother began to speak, Ethan observed how everyone in the room naturally moved into their roles. Sophia assessing medical needs, Grace offering maternal comfort, Alexander taking notes for the program, Elizabeth organizing resources, and Victor simply observing with bright eyes how his old empire of power was transforming into an empire of love. "Do you know what's most beautiful?" Ethan whispered to his father. "That this is just the first of many stories we'll help rewrite." "Like ours," Victor replied, squeezing his son's shoulder, "which began with a broken heart and is ending with hundreds of hearts healing together." The old library of the Blackwell mansion, now converted into the Foundation's meeting room, buzzed with activity on that autumn morning. The walls, once covered with finance and economics books, now displayed photographs of reunited families and thank you letters. "Case number 15, Alexander announced, projecting an image on the screen. "Mary Sanders, separated from her son 12 years ago due to economic circumstances. The child was adopted by a family in Boston." Ethan, who was reviewing medical records alongside Sophia, looked up. "It reminds me of our story," he commented softly. "Every case does," Grace responded, who was knitting while listening. This time her knitting reproduced small butterflies among the hearts. because in every separation, there's hidden love waiting to bloom. Elizabeth, who had demonstrated a special talent for tracking families thanks to her years of experience secretly following Ethan, approached the screen. "I've already located the adoptive family. They're good parents, open to contact, like you, Grace." "And the boy?" Victor asked from his armchair near the window. "Paul, now 14 years old," Alexander replied, consulting his notes. "He's a brilliant student, especially in music. His biological mother was a piano teacher." "Like the melodies that unite us," Sophia murmured, remembering how she had recognized Ethan by the rhythm of his heart. At that moment, Olivia rushed in with news from the previous case. "The surgery was a success," she announced. "Little Anna is out of danger." Everyone sighed in relief. Anna was a 6-year-old girl who needed urgent surgery, but her single mother couldn't afford it. It was the first complex medical case the Foundation had taken on. "Her mother is in the reception," Olivia continued. "She wants to thank you personally." "We don't need thanks," Victor began, but Ethan gently interrupted him. "Yes, we do, Father. Not out of vanity, but because each thank you reminds us why we're doing this." Anna's mother entered timidly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Grace immediately stood up to hug her. "My little girl," the woman began. "The doctors say that without the operation." "But she had it," Sophia interrupted with professional gentleness. "And now she has a whole life ahead of her. Do you know what she said when she woke up?" The mother continued with a smile through tears. "She said she dreamed of angels knitting hearts." Grace looked at her knitting and laughed softly. "Angels sometimes use knitting needles." "And stethoscopes," Alexander added, winking at Sophia. At that moment, Elizabeth received a call that made her pale. "It's about the Sanders case," she announced after hanging up. "Paul, the boy, he wants to meet his biological mother. Now." "Now?" Victor asked, surprised. "He's outside," Elizabeth replied. "He came with his adoptive family from Boston without warning. He says that after seeing our story on the news, he couldn't wait any longer." Ethan immediately stood up. "I'll go receive them. I know exactly how he feels." "I'll go with you," Alexander said. "We brothers understand each other better." As the brothers left, Grace began to knit faster. "I'll need to finish this blanket today," she murmured. "Each reunited family deserves its own heart blanket." "And each heart its own melody," Sophia added, already planning preventive medical exams for Paul and his mother. In the reception, Paul waited nervously with his adoptive parents, a couple radiating love and understanding. As he saw Ethan and Alexander approaching, the teenager straightened up. "Are you—" he began timidly. "The Blackwell brothers," Ethan completed with a warm smile. "But more importantly, we're like you, people who discovered that love has many forms. And many hearts," Alexander added, remembering his own transformation. "Does it hurt?" Paul suddenly asked. When you finally find them?" Ethan exchanged a glance with his brother before responding. "It hurts, yes, but it's a pain that heals, like when a broken bone welds stronger than before." "And is there room?" the teenager continued. "In the heart? For everyone?" Alexander smiled, thinking about how his own heart had expanded to embrace not only his newly found brother, but an entire extended family. Love is the only space that grows the more you fill it. At that moment, Mary Sanders arrived, urgently summoned by Elizabeth. Upon seeing her son, she stopped, paralyzed by emotion. Paul looked at her, and something in his posture as he held the backpack where he carried his sheet music perfectly reflected the way his biological mother held her purse. "Play something for her," Ethan suggested softly. "Sometimes when words aren't enough, music speaks for us." The old music room of the Blackwell mansion, which miraculously still retained its grand piano, became the stage for a moment no one would forget. Paul sat in front of the instrument, his fingers trembling slightly over the ivory keys, while Mary remained standing, her hands clutching the sheet music she always carried with her. "It's the same," she whispered, recognizing the piece Paul began to play. "The sonata I composed when you were in my womb." The rest of the Blackwell family had discreetly gathered in the room. Grace knitted silently, her needles moving to the rhythm of the music. Sophia, with contained tears, recognized in the melody the same rhythmic pattern of Paul's heart that she had examined minutes before. "Music," Alexander murmured to Ethan, "has its own way of uniting hearts." Paul's adoptive parents, Sarah and Michael Thompson, watched with a mixture of pride and emotion as their son played with a passion they had never seen before. "We always knew his talent came from somewhere special," Sarah commented softly. "Now we understand where from." Elizabeth, who had remained in a corner, approached Mary. "How did you keep it alive?" she asked in a low voice. "The love, the music. How did you not let yourself be overcome by the pain?" Mary, without taking her eyes off her son, replied, "Every time I gave a piano lesson, I imagined it was him learning. Every note I taught was a love letter I hoped he would someday hear." Victor, leaning on his cane, observed the scene with a new understanding. "Music," he said, "does what money never could. Unites souls." Paul finished the first part of the sonata and, without turning, asked, "The second part, did you finish it?" Mary approached the piano, taking out some yellowed sheets from her purse. "I finished it on the day of your first birthday. Would you teach it to me?" Paul's voice trembled with emotion. We could play it together," Mary suggested, sitting timidly next to him on the piano bench. Ethan approached Grace, who had begun a new blanket with a design of musical notes intertwined with hearts. "It's as if each family we reunite teaches us a new form of love," he whispered. "Because each story is unique," Grace responded, "but they all speak the same language, that of the heart." As mother and son began to play together, something magical happened. The melody, which had been born from the pain of separation, was now transforming into a song of reunion. The notes flowed between them like a long-postponed conversation. Sophia approached the adoptive parents. "You've done a wonderful job," she said sincerely. "Paul is an exceptional young man." "And now he has twice the love," Michael replied, hugging his wife. "As they told us at the foundation, love multiplies, it doesn't divide." Alexander, who had been taking notes for the foundation's case registry, put his tablet aside. "You know, every case we handle is special, but this reminds us why we started all this." Elizabeth nodded. "Because every lost note finds its melody, like every heart finds its home." The music reached a crescendo, and everyone could see how tears flowed freely down Paul and Mary's faces, though their hands never stopped playing. It was as if years of unspoken words, unshared hugs, lost moments, were being channeled through each note. "The foundation needs a music program," Victor suddenly decided. "A space where families can meet through art. Melodies that unite," Ethan suggested, "a perfect complement to intertwined hearts." "And Mary could lead it," Alexander added. "Who better than someone who kept love alive through music?" Grace finished a row of her knitting and looked up at the family gathered around the piano. "Every day," she said softly, "we discover new ways to heal, new ways to love." The sonata came to an end, and for a moment, the silence that followed was filled with all the emotions that words couldn't express. Paul finally turned to Mary, and in a gesture that moved everyone present, he took her hand and brought it to his heart. "It beats like your music," he said simply. A month after the encounter between Paul and Mary, the old ballroom of the Blackwell mansion had transformed into a music conservatory. The walls, now decorated with Grace's blankets and framed sheet music, vibrated with the notes of a dozen instruments as newly reunited families found a common language in music. "It's incredible," Ethan commented to Alexander as they watched a group class led by Mary. "Each family has its own melody. Like each story has its own rhythm," Alexander replied, pointing to a girl playing the violin alongside her newly found biological mother. "Remember Anna? When she arrived, she could barely look her mother in the eye. Now look how their bows move in perfect synchrony." Sophia, who had been conducting medical checkups on all the program participants, joined them. "The therapeutic benefits are amazing," she explained with professional enthusiasm. "Stress levels decrease, blood pressure stabilizes, and sleep patterns significantly improve when families play together." At that moment, Grace entered with a new batch of blankets, each woven with a unique design that combined musical notes with hearts. "Each blanket tells a story," she explained as she distributed them, "like each song they play together." Elizabeth, who had discovered an unexpected talent for organizing musical events, was coordinating the foundation's first benefit concert. "Paul and Mary will open the program," she announced, consulting her tablet. "Their sonata has become a symbol of hope for other families." "And not just that," Victor added, entering the room supported by his cane. Other foundations from all over the country want to replicate the program. Melodies that unite could become a national movement. Mary paused in her class to greet the Blackwell family. Her face radiated with a joy that only recovered love can give. "Every day we discover new ways to connect," she said, pointing to her students. Yesterday, a mother recognized her daughter by the way she held the flute, exactly as she did at her age. "Gestures don't lie," Grace commented softly. "Like when I first saw Ethan, and I knew in my heart that he was destined to be my son." The class continued, and a new family timidly entered the room. It was their first session, a father who had found his daughter after 20 years of separation. They both shared the same passion for jazz piano. "Welcome to your new home," Mary greeted them, guiding them towards one of the pianos. "Here, notes are bridges between hearts." Ethan observed how father and daughter sat together in front of the piano, their hands instinctively finding the same keys. "It's like a mirror," he whispered to Sophia. "Like when we discovered we had the same type of arrhythmia." "Genetics is amazing," Sophia replied, her voice mixing maternal pride with scientific fascination. "But love is a miracle." Alexander, who had been documenting each story for the Foundation's archives, closed his laptop. "You know, every time I record a new case, I think about my mother's letter. She knew that someday we would find a way to heal." Elizabeth approached her grandson, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would be proud, not just of you, but of how you've helped transform pain into something beautiful." At that moment, Paul came running into the room, waving a sheet of music. "I finished it," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "The third part of the sonata." Mary left her class for a moment, taking the sheets with trembling hands. It's perfect," she whispered as she read the notes. "You've taken the original melody and transformed it into something new, but keeping its essence." "Like our family," Victor commented, observing everyone present. "We've taken the pain of the past and transformed it into a symphony of hope." Grace, who had started a new blanket inspired by Paul's score, smiled. "And every day we add new notes to this melody." "New hearts," Sophia added. "New stories," Alexander completed. Music filled the room, a mix of instruments and voices that intertwined like the threads in Grace's blankets. Each note, each chord, each melody was a testimony that love, when given the chance, can create the most beautiful of symphonies. And in the midst of it all, Ethan observed with an overflowing heart. His own journey of healing had unleashed a wave of hope that kept growing, reaching more and more families every day. The Blackwell Empire had transformed into something that no amount of money could buy, a sanctuary where broken hearts found their lost melody. The old music room of the Blackwell mansion, which miraculously still retained its grand piano, became the stage for a moment no one would forget. Paul sat in front of the instrument, his fingers trembling slightly over the ivory keys, while Mary remained standing, her hands clutching the sheet music she always carried with her. "It's the same," she whispered, recognizing the piece Paul began to play. "The sonata I composed when you were in my womb." The rest of the Blackwell family had discreetly gathered in the room. Grace knitted silently, her needles moving to the rhythm of the music. Sophia, with contained tears, recognized in the melody the same rhythmic pattern of Paul's heart that she had examined minutes before. "Music," Alexander murmured to Ethan, "has its own way of uniting hearts." Paul's adoptive parents, Sarah and Michael Thompson, watched with a mixture of pride and emotion as their son played with a passion they had never seen before. "We always knew his talent came from somewhere special," Sarah commented softly. "Now we understand where from." Elizabeth, who had remained in a corner, approached Mary. "How did you keep it alive?" she asked in a low voice. "The love, the music. How did you not let yourself be overcome by the pain?" Mary, without taking her eyes off her son, replied, "Every time I gave a piano lesson, I imagined it was him learning. Every note I taught was a love letter I hoped he would someday hear." Victor, leaning on his cane, observed the scene with a new understanding. "Music," he said, "does what money never could. Unites souls." Paul finished the first part of the sonata and, without turning, asked, "The second part, did you finish it?" Mary approached the piano, taking out some yellowed sheets from her purse. "I finished it on the day of your first birthday. Would you teach it to me?" Paul's voice trembled with emotion. We could play it together," Mary suggested, sitting timidly next to him on the piano bench. Ethan approached Grace, who had begun a new blanket with a design of musical notes intertwined with hearts. "It's as if each family we reunite teaches us a new form of love," he whispered. "Because each story is unique," Grace responded, "but they all speak the same language, that of the heart." As mother and son began to play together, something magical happened. The melody, which had been born from the pain of separation, was now transforming into a song of reunion. The notes flowed between them like a long-postponed conversation. Sophia approached the adoptive parents. "You've done a wonderful job," she said sincerely. "Paul is an exceptional young man." "And now he has twice the love," Michael replied, hugging his wife. "As they told us at the foundation, love multiplies, it doesn't divide." Alexander, who had been taking notes for the foundation's case registry, put his tablet aside. "You know, every case we handle is special, but this reminds us why we started all this." Elizabeth nodded. "Because every lost note finds its melody, like every heart finds its home." The music reached a crescendo and everyone could see how tears flowed freely down Paul and Mary's faces, though their hands never stopped playing. It was as if years of unspoken words, unshared hugs, lost moments, were being channeled through each note. "The foundation needs a music program," Victor suddenly decided. "A space where families can meet through art. Melodies that unite," Ethan suggested, "a perfect complement to intertwined hearts." "And Mary could lead it," Alexander added. "Who better than someone who kept love alive through music?" Grace finished a row of her knitting and looked up at the family gathered around the piano. "Every day," she said softly, "we discover new ways to heal, new ways to love." The sonata came to an end, and for a moment, the silence that followed was filled with all the emotions that words couldn't express. Paul finally turned to Mary, and in a gesture that moved everyone present, he took her hand and brought it to his heart. "It beats like your music," he said simply. A month after the encounter between Paul and Mary, the old ballroom of the Blackwell mansion had transformed into a music conservatory. The walls, now decorated with Grace's blankets and framed sheet music, vibrated with the notes of a dozen instruments as newly reunited families found a common language in music. "It's incredible," Ethan commented to Alexander as they watched a group class led by Mary. "Each family has its own melody. Like each story has its own rhythm," Alexander replied, pointing to a girl playing the violin alongside her newly found biological mother. "Remember Anna? When she arrived, she could barely look her mother in the eye. Now look how their bows move in perfect synchrony." Sophia, who had been conducting medical checkups on all the program participants, joined them. "The therapeutic benefits are amazing," she explained with professional enthusiasm. "Stress levels decrease, blood pressure stabilizes, and sleep patterns significantly improve when families play together." At that moment, Grace entered with a new batch of blankets, each woven with a unique design that combined musical notes with hearts. "Each blanket tells a story," she explained as she distributed them, "like each song they play together." Elizabeth, who had discovered an unexpected talent for organizing musical events, was coordinating the foundation's first benefit concert. "Paul and Mary will open the program," she announced, consulting her tablet. "Their sonata has become a symbol of hope for other families." "And not just that," Victor added, entering the room supported by his cane. "Other foundations from all over the country want to replicate the program. Melodies that unite could become a national movement." Mary paused in her class to greet the Blackwell family. Her face radiated with a joy that only recovered love can give. "Every day we discover new ways to connect," she said, pointing to her students. "Yesterday, a mother recognized her daughter by the way she held the flute, exactly as she did at her age." "Gestures don't lie," Grace commented softly. "Like when I first saw Ethan, and I knew in my heart that he was destined to be my son." The class continued, and a new family timidly entered the room. It was their first session, a father who had found his daughter after 20 years of separation. They both shared the same passion for jazz piano. "Welcome to your new home," Mary greeted them, guiding them towards one of the pianos. "Here, notes are bridges between hearts." Ethan observed how father and daughter sat together in front of the piano, their hands instinctively finding the same keys. "It's like a mirror," he whispered to Sophia. "Like when we discovered we had the same type of arrhythmia." Genetics is amazing, Sophia replied, her voice mixing maternal pride with scientific fascination. But love is a miracle. Alexander, who had been documenting each story for the Foundation's archives, closed his laptop. You know, every time I record a new case, I think about my mother's letter. She knew that someday we would find a way to heal. Elizabeth approached her grandson, placing a hand on his shoulder. Your mother would be proud, not just of you, but of how you've helped transform pain into something beautiful. At that moment, Paul came running into the room, waving a sheet of music. I finished it, he exclaimed enthusiastically. The third part of the sonata. Mary left her class for a moment, taking the sheets with trembling hands. It's perfect, she whispered as she read the notes. You've taken the original melody and transformed it into something new, but keeping its essence. Like our family, Victor commented, observing everyone present. We've taken the pain of the past and transformed it into a symphony of hope. Grace, who had started a new blanket inspired by Paul's score, smiled. And every day we add new notes to this melody. New hearts, Sophia added. New stories, Alexander completed. Music filled the room, a mix of instruments and voices that intertwined like the threads in Grace's blankets. Each note, each chord, each melody was a testimony that love, when given the chance, can create the most beautiful of symphonies. And in the midst of it all, Ethan observed with an overflowing heart. His own journey of healing had unleashed a wave of hope that kept growing, reaching more and more families every day. The Blackwell Empire had transformed into something that no amount of money could buy, a sanctuary where broken hearts found their lost melody. The Carnegie Hall buzzed with activity on the eve of the grand benefit concert. Technicians adjusted the lights, while families from the Melodies That Unite program conducted their final dress rehearsal. At the center of the stage, a huge tapestry woven by Grace combining hearts and musical notes served as a backdrop. It's like a dream, Mary murmured, adjusting the grand piano where she and Paul would open the concert. Just 2 months ago, I thought I would never see my son again. And now you're creating music with him, Sophia completed, who discreetly supervised the vital signs of all participants, and helping other families find their own melody. Ethan and Alexander walked the halls of the theater, placing the special blankets Grace had woven for each participating family in their respective dressing rooms. Each blanket told a unique story of separation and reunion. Remember when we thought we were rivals? Alexander asked with a smile as they hung a particularly beautiful blanket. It seems like another life, Ethan replied, as if all the pain and resentment had been just the tuning before the real melody. Elizabeth, transformed into an efficient event director, coordinated the final details with a precision that recalled her days directing the business empire, but now her energy was channeled towards something more meaningful. The tickets are sold out, she announced to Victor, who was watching the rehearsal from a box. And the best part is that each ticket sold will fund medical treatment for a family in need. Money finally serving its true purpose, Victor reflected. Not to divide families, but to reunite them. Grace, seated in the front row, was knitting what seemed to be her most ambitious work to date, a blanket that represented a family tree. But instead of names, it was composed of intertwined hearts and musical notes. It's for the theater lobby, she explained when Sophia sat beside her. Each branch represents a family that has found its way back to love. On stage, Paul and Mary rehearsed the sonata that had started it all. The melody, now completed with the new section composed by Paul, flowed like a conversation between mother and son, each note charged with years of contained love. It's incredible, Dr. Evans commented, who had come to supervise the medical event. Their cardiac patterns synchronize perfectly when they play together. Like ours, Alexander added, showing the heart monitor he still occasionally used. Family has its own rhythm. A young couple timidly approached Ethan. They were next in the program, a mother who had found her daughter after 15 years, both violinists. We're afraid, the mother confessed. What if we can't connect in front of so many people? Ethan smiled understandingly. The music is just the bridge, he explained. Love is the real melody, and that's already in your hearts. Elizabeth, who had overheard the conversation, approached. When I first saw Ethan in the hospital, I thought fear would paralyze me. But love is stronger than any fear. At that moment, the theater doors opened, and the first guests began to arrive for the dress rehearsal. Families hoping to find their loved ones, inspired by the stories they had heard about the Blackwell Foundation. Each person who enters, Grace observed, is a new opportunity to heal a broken heart. And each note we play, Mary added from the piano, is a light of hope for someone seeking their way home. Victor stood up from his seat, leaning on his cane. Tomorrow, he announced, we won't just be presenting a concert. We'll be presenting a testimony that love can rewrite any story, and that music, Paul completed, can unite what life separated. The theater lights began to dim, signaling the start of the dress rehearsal. In the darkness, Grace's tapestry glowed softly, its intertwined threads reflecting light, like the strings of a celestial instrument. "It's time," Ethan whispered, and in his voice echoed the echo of all the families who had found their way back to love through the Blackwell Foundation. The first note of Paul and Mary's sonata floated in the air, clear and pure like a drop of water in a calm pond, creating waves of hope that expanded more and more, reaching every heart in the theater. The Blackwell Empire had finally found its true vocation, not in the glass and steel skyscrapers, but in the notes of a melody that healed broken hearts and reunited separated souls. The night of the concert, Carnegie Hall sparkled with an energy that went beyond mere anticipation. The lobby was filled with families, some reunited, others still hoping, all bound by the promise of healing through music. Grace's family tree tapestry hung prominently, each thread seeming to pulse with life under the soft lighting. Backstage, Paul nervously adjusted his tie while Mary smoothed out her dress. Ethan approached them carrying one of Grace's special blankets. "This is for you," he said, draping it over their shoulders. "A reminder that your story is part of something bigger now." Paul touched the intricate pattern of musical notes and hearts. "It feels like a hug from the universe," he murmured. "That's Grace's magic," Alexander added, joining them. "She weaves love into every stitch." In her dressing room, Sophia was reviewing last-minute medical data on her tablet. A soft knock on the door revealed Elizabeth. "Are you ready?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tinged with an unfamiliar nervousness. Sophia looked up, surprised. "I think so. Are you?" Elizabeth stepped inside, closing the door. I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for giving our family a second chance, for giving me a chance to be the grandmother I should have been from the start." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as she embraced Elizabeth. "We're all getting second chances here," she whispered. Meanwhile, in the wings, Victor stood with Grace watching the audience file in. "Look at them all," Grace marveled. "So many hearts beating with hope." Victor nodded, his eyes misty. "I used to measure success in dollars and cents. Now I see it in reunited families and healed hearts." The lights dimmed, signaling 5 minutes to curtain. Ethan gathered the entire Blackwell family in a tight circle backstage. "Remember," he said, looking at each face in turn, "our story is just the beginning. Tonight we're opening the door for countless others to find their way home." As they broke apart, Alexander caught Ethan's arm. "Thank you, brother," he said quietly, "for showing me that family is more than blood." The curtain rose to reveal Paul and Mary at the grand piano. As their fingers touched the keys, the first notes of their sonata filled the hall. The audience held its collective breath, sensing the power of the moment. From the wings, Ethan watched as the music wove its spell. He saw tears glistening on cheeks, hands reaching out to loved ones, and faces lighting up with recognition and hope. As the concert progressed, each performance told a story of separation and reunion. A father and daughter's guitar duet spoke of years of searching. A mother and son's violin piece sang of rediscovered connection. With each note, the Blackwell Foundation's mission became clearer: to use the universal language of music to heal the wounds of the past and build bridges to the future. During intermission, Ethan overheard snippets of conversation from the audience. "If the Blackwells could heal their family after so many years, I'm going to call my estranged sister tomorrow. Maybe it's not too late for us." He smiled, realizing that the ripple effect of their family's journey was already beginning. The second half of the concert opened with a surprise. Victor took the stage, supported by Alexander and Ethan. The audience hushed as he made his way to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong despite his frail appearance, "tonight is not just about music. It's about the melody of life, which sometimes includes painful pauses and discordant notes. But as we've learned, with love and perseverance, even the most broken melody can be made whole again. He gestured to his sons, to Sophia, Grace, and Elizabeth, who joined him on stage. This is my family, once fractured, now reunited. And we stand before you tonight, not as the Blackwell Empire, but as living proof that it's never too late to rewrite your story. As Victor spoke, a montage of family photos played on the screen behind them, from old pictures of baby Ethan to recent snapshots of their reunited family. The final image was a group photo taken just that morning, everyone's faces alight with genuine happiness. The Blackwell Foundation is more than a charity, Victor continued. It's a promise that every lost note can find its way back to the symphony, that every broken heart can beat in harmony once again. The audience rose in a standing ovation, many wiping tears from their eyes. As the applause died down, Paul and Mary returned to the piano for the final piece of the night, the completed sonata, including the new section Paul had composed. As they played, Ethan felt a hand slip into his. He looked down to see Grace smiling up at him, her eyes shining. "Listen," she whispered. "Do you hear it?" Ethan closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. And there, beneath the complex melodies and harmonies, he heard it, a simple, steady rhythm like a heartbeat, the rhythm of family, of love, of home. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of profound silence before the hall erupted in thunderous applause. Ethan looked around at his family, at the parents who had raised him, the brother he had found, the grandmother who had protected him from afar, and the biological mother who had never stopped loving him. In that moment, he knew that the Blackwell Empire hadn't ended. It had simply transformed into something far more valuable, a legacy of love, healing, and hope that would resonate for generations to come. The concert may have been over, but for countless families in the audience and beyond, a new song was just beginning. In the weeks following the Carnegie Hall concert, the Blackwell Foundation experienced an unprecedented surge of interest and support. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and exclusivity, now buzzed with activity as families from all walks of life came seeking hope and healing. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan found himself in what used to be his father's study, now transformed into a cozy meeting room. The mahogany desk had been replaced by a large round table, symbolizing the equality and unity the foundation now stood for. "We've received over 1,000 applications in the last month alone," Alexander announced, scrolling through his tablet. Families separated by circumstances ranging from adoption to immigration issues, even some cases of witness protection programs. Sophia, who had been reviewing medical files, looked up with a mix of excitement and concern. "The demand for our medical services has tripled. We're going to need to expand our team and our facilities," Grace added, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on yet another family blanket. "We're running out of space for all the music therapy sessions." Victor, who had been quietly observing from his armchair by the window, spoke up. "I think it's time we considered opening branches in other cities." "The need clearly extends beyond New York," Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "I've been in talks with some of our old business partners. Many are interested in redirecting their resources towards the Foundation's mission." As they discussed the logistics of expansion, there was a soft knock on the door. Olivia peeked in, her face alight with excitement. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here you all need to meet." She stepped aside, revealing a middle-aged woman with a striking resemblance to Elizabeth. The room fell silent as recognition dawned on their faces. "Aunt Margaret?" Ethan whispered, remembering the stories he'd heard about Elizabeth's long-estranged sister. Elizabeth stood slowly, her usual composure faltering. "Maggie? Is it really you?" Margaret stepped into the room, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I saw the concert on TV," she said softly. "I saw what you've all created here, and I thought maybe it wasn't too late for us either." For a moment, Elizabeth stood frozen, decades of hurt and misunderstanding hanging between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, she crossed the room in quick strides and enveloped her sister in a tight embrace. As the sisters reunited, Ethan felt a warm hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Grace smiling at him, her eyes shining with pride and love. "You see," she said softly, "the ripples keep spreading. Your family's healing is healing others." Alexander chimed in. It's like that theory of the butterfly effect. Our small acts of forgiveness and love are creating waves of change. Victor wheeled his chair closer to the group, his face etched with a mixture of joy and wistfulness. I keep thinking about all the years we lost, he mused. But then I look at what we've created here and I realize maybe those years weren't lost after all. Maybe they were the price we had to pay to learn these invaluable lessons. Sophia, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. In medicine, we often say that healing isn't just about curing the disease. It's about restoring balance, finding harmony. What we're doing here, it's not just reuniting families. We're restoring the harmony of countless lives. As Margaret and Elizabeth began to share stories, filling in the gaps of their years apart, Paul entered the room carrying his violin case. "Sorry I'm late," he said, slightly out of breath. "I was working on a new piece for the next concert." Mary, who had been helping with music therapy sessions, beamed with pride. "He's composing a symphony," she explained to the others. "Each movement represents a different stage of separation and reunion." "That's beautiful, Paul," Ethan said warmly. "Will you play a bit for us?" Paul nodded, taking out his violin. As he began to play, a hush fell over the room. The melody was haunting and hopeful, filled with longing and joy. It seemed to capture perfectly the journey they had all been on, the pain of separation, the yearning for connection, and the indescribable joy of coming home. As the music filled the air, Ethan looked around the room at his extraordinary family. Grace, her hands stilled on her knitting as she listened. Sophia, her eyes closed as she swayed gently to the music. Alexander, his arm draped casually over the back of Victor's wheelchair. Elizabeth and Margaret, hands clasped as they listened together. And Victor, his face serene, looking for all the world like a man who had finally found his true purpose. In that moment, Ethan realized that the Blackwell legacy had indeed been transformed. What was once built on money and power was now founded on love, forgiveness, and the healing power of music. The empire hadn't fallen. It had evolved into something far more valuable and enduring. As Paul's song came to an end, there was a moment of reverent silence before the room burst into applause. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude and purpose wash over him. They had all come so far, and yet he knew this was just the beginning. The Blackwell Foundation was more than a charity or a family project. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a living proof that it's never too late to rewrite your story and find your way back home. As the family began to discuss plans for the next concert, the next outreach program, the next family to help, Ethan knew in his heart that the melody of their lives would continue to grow richer and more beautiful with each passing day. The once cold halls of the Blackwell mansion now resonated with the warmth of love and the harmony of healed hearts. And in this new symphony of life, every member of the family, old and new, by blood and by choice, had found their perfect note.